The chandelier light caught the diamond ring as it rolled across polished marble, each rotation a small death. 200 witnesses held their breath while Duke Nathaniel Ashford stood frozen at the head table, watching the woman he claimed to love walk away without trembling, without tears, without giving him the satisfaction of her collapse. The silence crushed harder than any scream could. In that moment, every eye in the ballroom understood what power truly looked like, and it wasn't wearing the crimson sash of British nobility. It was walking toward the exit in a silver gown, spine straight, while cameras flashed and the future king of social ruin was born. Some mistakes don't ask for forgiveness. They demand you watch them leave. What happened next would make headlines for reasons no one expected, and if you stay until the reckoning comes, you'll understand why some betrayals are designed by the people who swear they'd never hurt you.
But,
3 days before the wedding, the letter arrived in a cream envelope with no return address. Nathaniel Ashford stood in his private study at Blackthorn Palace, the kind of room that smelled like leather-bound law books and 2 centuries of inherited arrogance. Outside the windows, London drowned in October rain. Inside, his hands shook as he read the typewritten words for the 5th time. Lady Eveline Carter has spent 7 years infiltrating your family. Her father's death was no accident, and neither is her engagement to you. She seeks revenge against the crown for crimes your bloodline helped commit. The wedding is her endgame. Protect the duchy before she destroys it. No signature, no proof, just enough detail to feel true. Nathaniel's mind raced through every moment he'd shared with Eveline, every late-night conversation about reform, every time she'd questioned the royal council's decisions, every instance she'd pushed him toward transparency. He'd called it integrity. Now the letter reframed it as infiltration. His private secretary, Marcus Webb, stood near the door with the expression of a man who'd seen too many aristocratic scandals to be shocked by one more. "You believe this?" Nathaniel asked, his voice tight. Marcus chose his words carefully. "I believe someone wants you to believe it, Your Grace. That's not an answer." The older man's jaw tightened. Lady Eveline's father died in a mining accident 23 years ago. The same mines your family's investment group owned at the time. The same accident that was ruled operator error, despite 3 engineers claiming the safety reports were falsified. Nathaniel felt cold spread through his chest. "I was a child when that happened, but your uncle wasn't. Lord Cedric managed the family's industrial holdings back then. If there was a cover-up, he would have been involved." The implication hung between them like smoke from a gun already fired. Nathaniel walked to the window, rain streaking the glass like tears the sky refused to hold back. Eveline had never mentioned her father's death, not once in 7 years. That silence suddenly felt like strategy. "What do you want me to do?" Marcus asked quietly. Nathaniel's reflection stared back at him. A man trained from birth to protect the institution above all else, to sacrifice personal desire for public duty, to never let emotion compromise the crown. He'd been raised to make exactly this kind of choice. "I need to end it," Nathaniel said, publicly, before she has the chance to finish whatever she started. Marcus didn't argue. Men in their position didn't get the luxury of waiting for certainty. The royal banquet took place at Ashford Hall, a crystalline monument to wealth that made most palaces look modest. 400 guests filled the grand ballroom, members of parliament, foreign dignitaries, old money families who measured their worth in centuries instead of millions. Eveline Carter stood beside Nathaniel at the head table, wearing a silver gown that moved like liquid mercury under the chandeliers. Her dark hair was pulled back in a style that emphasized the sharp intelligence in her green eyes. She looked calm, untouchable. Exactly the kind of woman who could smile while planning destruction. Nathaniel had barely spoken to her all evening. Every time she reached for his hand, he found a reason to pull away. She noticed. Of course she noticed. Eveline Carter noticed everything. "Are you going to tell me what's wrong?" she said quietly during the 3rd course. "Or are we going to keep pretending this is about stress over the wedding?" He took a long drink of wine instead of answering. Across the table, Lord Cedric Ashford watched them both with the kind of satisfaction predators feel right before the kill. Nathaniel's uncle was 62, silver-haired, and politically untouchable. He'd survived 4 separate investigations into financial corruption by knowing exactly which secrets to keep and which threats to deploy. If Eveline was planning revenge, Cedric would be her primary target. which meant Cedric had every reason to want her destroyed first. The thought landed in Nathaniel's mind like a stone through glass, but he pushed it away. Paranoia wouldn't protect the family. Action would. He stood abruptly, the screech of his chair cutting through conversation. The ballroom fell silent. Eveline looked up at him, confusion flickering across her face. Nathaniel's voice carried across the room with the kind of authority that came from generations of men who'd ruled without question. Ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate you joining us tonight. However, I must make an announcement regarding the upcoming wedding. Eveline's hand froze halfway to her wine glass. After careful consideration, Nathaniel continued, his tone as cold as contract law. I have decided to end my engagement to Lady Eveline Carter, effective immediately. The room erupted. Gasps. Whispers. The click and flash of a dozen phones capturing the moment for social media immortality. Eveline sat perfectly still, her face unreadable. Only the slight whitening of her knuckles betrayed anything happening beneath the surface. Nathaniel forced himself to look at her. This relationship was built on a foundation I can no longer trust. I will not marry someone whose loyalties remain in question. He expected her to fight, to demand an explanation, to cause a scene that would confirm every suspicion the letter had planted. Instead, Eveline stood with the kind of grace that made queens look clumsy. She removed the engagement ring from her finger, 3 carats of flawless diamond that had belonged to Nathaniel's grandmother, and placed it gently on the table between them. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet enough that only the front tables could hear. I loved you, Nathaniel. I loved you when you were afraid to reform the estate laws because it meant fighting your own family. I loved you when you chose political strategy over moral courage. I loved you even when I knew you'd eventually choose reputation over me. She stepped back from the table. But I will never love the man who humiliated me in front of the world because he was too much of a coward to ask me the truth. The silence that followed was absolute. Eveline walked toward the exit, heels clicking against marble with the steady rhythm of a heartbeat that refused to stop. Photographers scrambled, guests whispered. Lord Cedric smiled into his champagne, and Nathaniel Ashford stood at the head table surrounded by 400 people, feeling more alone than he'd ever felt in his life. The first headline hit social media 17 minutes later. Duke Ashford ends engagement in brutal public humiliation. Lady Eveline Carter walks out in silence. By morning, the story had metastasized into a feeding frenzy. Tabloids dissected every photo of Eveline from the past 7 years, reframing kindness as manipulation, intelligence as scheming, love as long-game revenge. Former friends gave interviews questioning her motives. Political rivals suggested she'd been a foreign operative. One particularly vicious columnist wrote an entire piece speculating that Eveline's charity work had been a cover for money laundering. The public execution was efficient and thorough. Eveline's phone number changed within 48 hours. Her London apartment sat empty. No forwarding address, no statement to the press. She simply vanished as if she'd never existed outside Nathaniel's orbit. Good, Nathaniel told himself. Better this way. He buried himself in royal obligations, council meetings, legislative reviews, public appearances where he smiled and pretended the weight in his chest was anything other than guilt pretending to be duty. Marcus Webb said nothing, but his silence carried judgment sharper than any reprimand. 3 weeks after the banquet, Lord Cedric invited Nathaniel to his private club for cigars and congratulations. They sat in leather chairs that cost more than most people's cars, surrounded by oil paintings of dead men who'd built empires on the backs of people they never bothered to name. You made the right choice, Cedric said, smoke curling from his lips. That woman would have destroyed everything we've built. Nathaniel stared into his brandy. Did you know her father? Cedric's expression didn't change. Thomas Carter? Vaguely. He worked in one of our mining operations. Died in an accident back in, 2003? Tragic. But these things happen. The engineers said the safety reports were falsified. Engineers say a lot of things when they're looking for someone to blame. Cedric leaned forward. Why are you asking about this? Nathaniel met his uncle's eyes. Because the letter that warned me about Eveline mentioned her father's death. And now I'm wondering who else knew that detail. Cedric's smile was thin and cold. You're suggesting I sent that letter? I'm suggesting someone did. And whoever it was knew exactly which fear to exploit. The older man stubbed out his cigar with deliberate precision. Nathaniel, you're young. You still think the world operates on truth and fairness. It doesn't. It operates on power and perception. Eveline Carter was a threat to both. I did what was necessary to protect this family. The admission landed like a confession wrapped in pride. Nathaniel's hands tightened around his glass. You fabricated evidence to destroy an innocent woman. I removed a liability before she could leverage your guilt into dismantling everything your ancestors built. Cedric stood, adjusting his cufflinks. And if you're smart, you'll thank me instead of second-guessing the decision that saved your future. He walked out, leaving Nathaniel alone with the portraits of men who'd made the same choices for 300 years. Babas! The unraveling started small. A former housemaid named Margaret Ross came forward with bank statements showing payments from Lord Cedric's personal account to a private investigator 3 months before the letter arrived. The investigator specialized in reputation destruction, fabricated evidence, planted stories, anonymous accusations designed to look credible enough to ruin lives. Then a journalist found emails between Cedric and a senior mining executive discussing the need to bury Thomas Carter's accident report permanently. The language was careful, legally insulated, but the intent was clear. Silence the engineers, pay off the family, make sure no one looked too closely at who'd signed off on defective equipment. Eveline's father had died because men like Cedric valued profit margins over human life. And Eveline, brilliant, principled Eveline, had spent years working in policy reform and charity, never knowing the man who'd killed her father was sitting across from her at family dinners, smiling. Nathaniel felt something inside him crack. He spent 3 days locked in his study, reading every document Margaret Ross had smuggled out before Cedric could destroy them. The conspiracy went back decades. Falsified inspections, bribed officials, workers who'd died in accidents that were never accidents at all. His family's fortune was built on a graveyard of people no one bothered to remember. And when one of those dead men's daughters had gotten close enough to possibly expose the truth, Cedric had weaponized Nathaniel's fear and made him the executioner. Marcus found him on the 4th day, staring at a photograph of Eveline from the engagement announcement. She was laughing in the picture, her hand resting on Nathaniel's chest, her eyes bright with something that looked dangerously close to hope. "I need to find her," Nathaniel said. Marcus handed him a folder. "Already did." The town was called Invermar, a dying mining community in the Scottish Highlands where the primary industries were poverty, alcoholism, and lung disease from 30 years of inhaling coal dust. Eveline had bought an old church and converted it into a charity hospital. Nathaniel arrived during a thunderstorm that turned the roads into rivers and the sky into a battlefield. His driver refused to go further than the town square, so Nathaniel walked the last half-mile in rain that soaked through his coat and turned his polished shoes into ruined leather. The hospital was a stone building with broken shutters and a roof that looked like it leaked in 12 places. Inside, the air smelled like disinfectant and exhaustion. A nurse in her 60s looked up from a medication cart, startled. "We're not taking new patients tonight unless it's an emergency," she said. "I'm here to see Eveline Carter." The nurse's expression hardened. "She doesn't want visitors. I'm not a visitor. I know who you are." The woman's voice could have cut glass. "You're the man who humiliated her in front of the entire country and then let the tabloids finish the job. So unless you're here to grovel, I suggest you leave before I call someone less polite than me." Nathaniel didn't move. "I need to apologize. Apologizing won't fix what you broke." "I know, but I have to try." The nurse stared at him for a long moment, weighing whether he deserved even the chance. Finally, she gestured down the hallway. "Exam room 3. Don't make me regret this." Eveline was stitching up a miner's hand when Nathaniel walked in. She didn't look up. "Hold still, Mr. Brennan." "Almost done." The miner, 50s, scarred hands, face like weathered stone, sat perfectly still while Eveline worked with the steady precision of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Nathaniel stood in the doorway, rain dripping onto linoleum, watching the woman he'd destroyed rebuild herself into something harder and more real than anything he'd ever been. When she finally finished, she snipped the thread and bandaged the wound with quick efficiency. "Keep it dry for 3 days. Come back if there's any sign of infection." The miner stood, nodded his thanks, and walked past Nathaniel without acknowledging him. Only then did Eveline turn around. Her face was thinner than he remembered. Exhaustion shadowed her eyes. but the steel in her gaze was new, forged in fire he'd lit and then walked away from. "You shouldn't be here," she said quietly. "I know." "Then why are you?" Nathaniel's carefully prepared speech evaporated. "Because I was wrong. Because my uncle fabricated the letter. Because your father's death wasn't an accident and I humiliated you to protect the man who killed him." Evelyn's jaw tightened, but she didn't look surprised. "When did you figure it out?" 3 weeks ago." "And it took you 3 weeks to come here?" The accusation landed like a slap. "I needed proof," Nathaniel said weakly. Evelyn laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You needed proof that I wasn't a liar. Even after everything we shared, you needed documentation before you could trust me." She turned back to the sink, scrubbing her hands with methodical violence. Nathaniel stepped closer. "I'm going to expose Cedric. I'm going to make sure everyone knows what he did. To your father, to the miners, to you. Good for you." Her voice was flat. "Does that come with a public apology, or are you just planning to ruin him quietly and call it justice?" "Both. I'll do whatever you want." Evelyn spun around, and for the first time he saw the full weight of her anger. "I don't want anything from you, Nathaniel. I don't want your apologies or your revenge or your guilt-driven grand gestures. I want you to leave." "I can't." "Why?" "Because you finally realized you loved me?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Nathaniel opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. Because the truth was too complicated and too humiliating to say out loud. Evelyn saw it in his silence. "You didn't love me," she said softly. "You loved the idea of me. The perfect partner who made you look compassionate and modern. The woman who stood beside you at charity events and made donors feel good about themselves. But the moment I became inconvenient, you threw me away. That's not—" "It is." Evelyn's voice cracked, just slightly. "You chose fear over me. You chose reputation over me. And when someone handed you a convenient excuse to walk away, you took it without even asking me if it was true." Nathaniel felt his throat tighten. "I was trying to protect the family." "No, you were protecting yourself. From the risk of being wrong. From the possibility that I might actually be more important than the duchy." She wiped her hands dry and walked past him toward the door. Nathaniel grabbed her arm, gently, desperately. "Evelyn, please." She pulled away like his touch burned. "I spent 7 years loving a man who didn't exist. Don't ask me to make that mistake again." She left him standing in the exam room, surrounded by bandages and antiseptic, feeling like every wound in the building was somehow his fault. Nathaniel returned to London the next morning, but the conversation replayed in his mind for days. "You didn't love me. You loved the idea of me." He wanted to argue, to insist she was wrong, but the more he examined his own memories, the more he realized she was right. He'd loved Evelyn when she made him look good, when she stood beside him at galas and made him feel like a reformer instead of just another entitled aristocrat coasting on inherited power. But the moment she became a liability, he'd cut her loose without hesitation. That wasn't love. That was convenience dressed up in expensive sentiment. The realization gutted him. Marcus found him in the study 2 nights later, staring at the rain. "The Royal Council meeting is tomorrow," the secretary said. "Are you ready?" Nathaniel nodded slowly. "I'm going to tell them everything. Cedric's corruption, the falsified reports, the miners who died because my family valued profit over safety. You'll destroy him." "Good." Marcus hesitated. "You'll also destroy part of your own legacy. The duchy's reputation will take years to recover." "I know." "And you're willing to accept that?" Nathaniel turned from the window. "I spent my entire life protecting a legacy built on lies. Maybe it's time to build something worth protecting instead." Market. The Royal Council chamber was oak-paneled and suffocating, filled with men who measured morality and political capital and treated truth like a negotiable commodity. Lord Cedric sat at the far end of the table, flanked by allies who'd spent decades helping him bury inconvenient facts. Nathaniel stood at the head of the room, a folder of documents in his hands and no illusions left to comfort him. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice steady, "I'm here to present evidence of financial corruption, criminal negligence, and conspiracy to commit fraud involving multiple members of this family, including myself." The room erupted. Cedric's face went white, then red, then cold. Over the next 2 hours, Nathaniel laid out everything. The falsified safety reports, the bribed officials, the payments to silence engineers. The anonymous letter designed to destroy Eveline before she could expose the truth. He didn't spare himself. He confessed to his own complicity, the willingness to believe the worst without evidence, the cowardice disguised as duty, the arrogance of thinking reputation mattered more than integrity. By the time he finished, 3 council members had resigned. 2 others demanded immediate investigations. And Lord Cedric Ashford sat in silence, watching his empire collapse in real time. "You've destroyed this family," Cedric said finally, his voice shaking with rage. Nathaniel met his uncle's eyes without flinching. "No. You did that 30 years ago. I'm just making sure everyone knows." Ook. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Cedric was arrested within 48 hours. The investigation expanded to include a dozen other executives and politicians who'd helped cover up decades of industrial negligence. The duchy's reputation shattered. Nathaniel surrendered control of the family's mining operations and transferred a significant portion of his inheritance into a victims fund for families affected by the accidents. The press, predictably, went insane. Some called him a hero. Others called him a traitor. Most just called him a fool for choosing morality over power. He didn't care anymore. The only opinion that mattered was 800 miles north, stitching wounds in a dying town, refusing to answer his letters. 6 months passed. Nathaniel didn't return to Scotland immediately. He knew showing up again would look like manipulation, another grand gesture designed to ease his guilt instead of actually earning forgiveness. Instead, he worked. He sold properties, liquidated investments, redirected funds toward hospitals, schools, and infrastructure in communities his family had exploited for generations. He testified at Cedric's trial, enduring cross-examination that painted him as either complicit or incompetent. He accepted both labels because they were true. And slowly, quietly, the narrative began to shift. Newspapers started running stories about the victims, miners' widows who finally received compensation, children who could afford medical care, towns that got clean water for the first time in decades. Eveline's name appeared in some of those stories. Her hospital had expanded. She'd hired 2 additional doctors and a full-time nurse. The building had a new roof. Patients came from 3 counties over because word had spread that someone actually cared whether they lived or died. Nathaniel read every article with the kind of pride that felt like heartbreak. She was better off without him. He knew that, but knowing it didn't make the loss hurt any less. He returned to Invermar on a cold March morning when the highlands were still dusted with snow. This time, he didn't arrive in a chauffeured car. He took the train, then walked the last 2 miles because he wanted to feel the weight of the distance. The hospital looked different, bigger. There was scaffolding on one side where a new wing was being constructed. Inside, the same nurse from before looked up from the reception desk. She almost smiled. "You're persistent, I'll give you that. Is she here?" "In her office. But if you're here to ask for forgiveness again, save your breath. She's done with apologies. I'm not here to apologize." "Then what are you here for?" Nathaniel set a leather folder on the desk. "To give her this." The nurse opened it, scanned the contents, and her eyebrows shot up. "This is a land transfer. The property surrounding this hospital, about 400 acres, plus an endowment large enough to fund operations for the next 20 years. No strings, no conditions. It's hers." The nurse stared at him. "Why?" "Because she's doing the work I should have started decades ago. And because I don't want forgiveness. I just want her to have what she needs to keep doing it." Before the nurse could respond, Eveline's voice cut through the hallway. "What's going on?" She appeared in the doorway, still wearing scrubs, hair pulled back in a messy bun, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. Then she saw Nathaniel. For a moment, neither of them moved. Finally, Eveline crossed her arms. "I thought I made it clear you weren't welcome here." Nathaniel didn't flinch. "You did. I'm not asking to stay, I just came to deliver this." He gestured to the folder. Eveline picked it up, read through the documents, and her expression shifted from anger to confusion to something that might have been shock. "This is yours. The land, the money, the legal rights. All of it. No conditions." Eveline looked at him, searching for the angle. "What do you want in return?" "Nothing. That's not how people like you operate." Nathaniel's voice was quiet but steady. "People like me don't." But I'm trying not to be that person anymore. Eveline set the folder down. You think money fixes what you did? No, but it might help you build something that does. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything unsaid. Finally, Eveline spoke. Why now? Why not 6 months ago when you first came here? Because 6 months ago I was still trying to fix myself so I could deserve you. Nathaniel met her eyes. Now I know that's not how this works. You don't owe me forgiveness. You don't owe me a second chance. You don't owe me anything. But these people, the ones you're helping, they deserve better than what my family gave them. So I'm giving them better. Through you. Eveline's jaw tightened, but something in her gaze softened just slightly. Did you love me, Nathaniel? Or did you just love the version of yourself you saw when I was standing next to you? The question he'd been avoiding for 8 months. Nathaniel took a breath. I don't know if I knew how to love anyone back then. I was too busy protecting a legacy I didn't build and preserving a reputation I hadn't earned. But I know I failed you. And I know that failure taught me more about who I actually want to be than 30 years of being the perfect Duke ever did. Eveline didn't respond immediately. She walked to the window, staring out at the construction site where workers were framing the new wing. When she finally turned back, her expression was unreadable. I'm not going to forgive you today, she said. Maybe not ever. What you did, publicly humiliating me, choosing fear over trust, that doesn't disappear because you wrote a check. I know, but... She hesitated. This hospital needs the resources. These people need the land. So I'll accept the donation. For them. Nathaniel nodded. That's all I'm asking. Eveline walked past him toward the door, then paused. If you're serious about being different, prove it. Don't send money from London and call it redemption. Stay. Work. Get your hands dirty. Show me you actually understand what it means to rebuild, instead of just tearing things down. She left before he could respond. But Nathaniel stood in the empty hallway, feeling something shift in his chest. Not hope, exactly, but maybe the beginning of understanding what hope might cost. He stayed, not in the hospital. Eveline made it clear he wasn't qualified for medical work, but in the town. He rented a room above the general store and started showing up at the construction site every morning at 6. The workers didn't trust him at first. Why would they? He was the man whose family had killed their fathers and grandfathers in mines that valued coal over human life. But Nathaniel showed up anyway. He hauled lumber, mixed concrete, learned how to frame walls from men who'd been doing it since before he was born. He didn't talk about his title, didn't mention his family, just worked until his hands blistered and his back screamed and he understood, in some small way, what it meant to build something instead of inheriting it. Eveline watched from a distance, saying nothing. But one afternoon, 3 months into the construction, she appeared at the site with 2 cups of coffee. You're still here, she said, handing him one. Nathaniel wiped sweat from his forehead. I said I would be. Most people like you don't keep promises that require actual effort. I'm trying not to be most people like me. Eveline took a sip of her coffee, studying him. The new wing opens next month. We're going to treat an additional 200 patients a year. That's incredible. It's necessary. She looked at the building rising from the ground. These people were forgotten by everyone who was supposed to protect them. I won't let that happen again. Nathaniel heard the weight in her voice, the kind that came from carrying other people's suffering because no one else would. You're doing what I should have done from the beginning, he said quietly. Eveline turned to him. You can't undo the past, Nathaniel, but you can stop pretending it didn't happen. That's the difference between apology and accountability. She walked away, leaving him standing in sawdust and unfinished walls, finally understanding the gap between saying sorry and actually changing. The hospital opened on a Saturday in late spring. The entire town showed up. Miners and their families, shopkeepers, teachers, people who'd spent their whole lives being told they didn't matter enough to invest in. Eveline stood at the entrance, exhausted and radiant, as patients walked through doors that finally felt like hope instead of charity. Nathaniel stood at the back of the crowd, watching her greet every single person by name. She'd built this, not with inherited wealth or political connections, with stubborn refusal to let cruelty win. A reporter from one of the national papers approached him, microphone ready. Duke Ashford, how does it feel to see this project completed? Nathaniel glanced at the hospital, then back at Eveline. It's not my project. I just tried not to get in the way. But you funded it. I provided resources that should have been here decades ago. That's not heroism. That's bare minimum decency. The reporter blinked, unsure how to frame that soundbite. Nathaniel walked away before they could ask another question. Well, that night, after the crowds had gone and the celebration had ended, Nathaniel found Eveline sitting on the front steps of the hospital, staring up at stars that actually shone this far from the city. He sat down beside her, keeping a respectful distance. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, Eveline broke the silence. You didn't have to stay. I know, but you did anyway. Yeah. Why? Nathaniel considered the question, because leaving would have been easier. And I've spent my whole life choosing easy. Eveline turned to look at him, and in the starlight, her face looked softer than he'd seen in months. Did you mean it? She asked quietly. What you said about not knowing how to love. Nathaniel met her gaze. I meant it. I don't know if I'm capable of loving someone the way they deserve, but I know I want to learn, and I know I'd rather fail trying with you than succeed with someone easier. Eveline's expression was unreadable. That's not a love confession, Nathaniel. That's a warning. I know. She looked back at the stars. I'm not the same person I was before you destroyed me in that ballroom. Good. Because I'm not asking for that person back. I'm asking if there's any chance the person you are now could ever trust the person I'm trying to become. Eveline was quiet for a long time. Then, slowly, she reached over and took his hand. Her grip was tentative, uncertain, but real. I don't forgive you yet, she said, and I don't know if I ever will completely. But I'm willing to see if you actually mean what you say. Nathaniel felt something break open in his chest. Not relief, but the beginning of something that might, eventually, turn into it. That's more than I deserve. Eveline squeezed his hand once, then let go. Don't make me regret it. She stood and walked back inside the hospital, leaving Nathaniel alone with the stars and the weight of a second chance he hadn't earned, but was desperate not to waste. But across town, in a rented room that smelled like cigarettes and bitterness, someone else was watching the hospital through binoculars. Lord Cedric Ashford had been released on bail 3 days earlier, pending appeal. And as he watched his nephew sit on those steps, holding the hand of the woman who'd destroyed everything, Cedric's expression twisted into something cold and final. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Cedric Ashford didn't believe in second chances. He believed in leverage, consequences, and the brutal simplicity of making sure threats stayed buried. The night after the hospital opening, he sat in his rented room above the tobacco shop on Invermar's main street, watching headlights cut through fog while his lawyer droned on speakerphone about appeal strategies and procedural delays. Cedric wasn't listening, he was calculating. Nathaniel had committed the cardinal sin of their bloodline. He'd chosen principle over preservation. Worse, he'd done it publicly, transforming a manageable scandal into a moral crusade that had cost Cedric everything he'd spent 40 years building. The bail conditions were humiliating. No contact with family assets, no access to corporate accounts, no travel beyond a 50-mile radius without court approval. They'd stripped him of power and expected him to sit quietly while his nephew played redemption arc with the woman who'd started all of this. Cedric had other plans. He ended the call without saying goodbye and pulled out a burner phone he'd purchased with cash 2 counties over. 3 numbers were saved in the contacts. The first belonged to a journalist who specialized in reputation demolition. The second was a private investigator who didn't ask questions as long as the checks cleared. The third was someone Cedric had kept on retainer for situations that required solutions conventional law couldn't provide. He dialed the third number. It rang twice before a voice answered, flat and professionally devoid of curiosity. Talk. Cedric kept his tone measured. I need background on someone. Eveline Carter. Everything. Medical history, financial records, personal relationships, anything that can be weaponized. Timeline? 2 weeks. That's expensive. I don't care about the cost, I care about results. The line went quiet for 3 seconds. Then, send half up front, usual account. Cedric ended the call and stared at the hospital across the street, lights still burning in the upper windows where Eveline was probably finishing paperwork or checking on overnight patients. She thought she'd won. They both did. But winning required understanding that some battles never actually ended. They just waited for the right moment to resume. Cedric opened his laptop and began drafting an email to the journalist. The subject line read, "New evidence suggests Eveline Carter's charity may be fraudulent financial scheme." He didn't have evidence yet, but in his experience, accusations arrived faster than truth, and by the time anyone bothered fact-checking, the damage was already permanent. Manhattan. 3 days later, Nathaniel woke to 17 missed calls and a text from Marcus Webb that said only, "Turn on the news." He grabbed his phone, his stomach already tightening with the instinct that something had gone catastrophically wrong. The headline loaded slowly, each word landing like a fist. Duke's disgraced ex-fiancée under investigation for charity. Fraud. Allegations surface regarding misuse of donated funds at Scottish hospital. Nathaniel read the article 3 times, his pulse hammering in his ears. The report cited anonymous sources claiming Eveline had diverted donation money into personal accounts. It referenced financial discrepancies that couldn't be verified. It quoted a former employee who alleged unsafe working conditions and patients being turned away for inability to pay. Every single claim was either a distortion or an outright lie. But it didn't matter. The story was already spreading. Social media had picked it up. Rival news outlets were running their own versions. By noon, Eveline Carter would be facing another public execution, and this time Nathaniel's family name wouldn't protect her because he was the one who'd made sure everyone knew how corrupt that name actually was. He called Marcus. "Where did this come from?" The older man's voice was tight. "The byline belongs to Gerald Hutchins. He's a tabloid operative who takes money to destroy people. I'm guessing someone paid him very well." "Cedric. Most likely." Marcus paused. "Nathaniel, your uncle isn't just fighting the charges. He's trying to burn everything you've built with Eveline before the trial even starts. Can we prove he's behind it? Not quickly enough to stop the damage." Nathaniel hung up and drove to the hospital so fast he nearly wrapped his car around a stone wall on the second turn. He found Eveline in her office, surrounded by 3 board members and a lawyer who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. She glanced up when Nathaniel burst through the door, and the exhaustion in her eyes was so absolute it made him physically ache. "Not now," she said quietly. "Eveline, this is Cedric. He's trying to— I know who's behind it." She cut him off with the kind of calm that only came from being too tired to feel rage anymore. "And I know you want to fix it. But right now, I need you to leave so I can deal with the actual consequences." One of the board members, a stern woman in her 60s named Margaret, stood up. "Duke Ashford, with all due respect, your presence here is making things worse. The press is already speculating about your involvement. If you care about this hospital, you'll go." Nathaniel looked at Eveline, waiting for her to contradict them. She didn't. "Fine," he said, his voice tight. "But I'm not letting him destroy you again." He walked out before anyone could respond, his mind already racing through options that all felt inadequate. By evening, the story had metastasized into a full scandal. Donors started pulling funding. 2 nurses resigned under pressure from family members who believed the allegations. A group of protesters showed up outside the hospital with signs demanding accountability. Most of them bussed in from neighboring towns by organizers who'd been paid in cash. Eveline stood at her office window, watching the chaos unfold, feeling the weight of every decision that had led her to this moment. Her lawyer, a pragmatic man named Colin Reed, sat across from her with a folder full of contingency plans. "We can fight this," he said, "but it's going to take months, and in the meantime, your reputation will be shredded. Again." Eveline didn't turn from the window. "What's the alternative? You could step down, temporarily. Let someone else run the hospital while we handle the legal response. It would take pressure off the organization." Eveline's jaw tightened. "So I'm supposed to abandon the people I've been fighting for because some bastard fabricated a scandal? I'm saying you need to decide what's more important, your pride or the hospital's survival." The words landed like a blade. Eveline turned to face him. "If I step down, Cedric wins. He gets exactly what he wants. Me discredited, humiliated, and removed from anything that could threaten his appeal." Colin's expression softened slightly. "Then you need to be prepared for this to get worse before it gets better." But it got worse. The following morning, a patient filed a lawsuit claiming medical malpractice. The claim was baseless, a minor infection that had been treated successfully, but it fed the narrative that Eveline's hospital was dangerous. Then a local council member called for a formal investigation into the hospital's finances. Then someone leaked Eveline's personal tax returns to the press, highlighting a large deposit from Nathaniel's land transfer and framing it as suspicious. Every attack was coordinated, every revelation timed for maximum damage. Nathaniel watched it unfold from his rented room, feeling helpless in a way he'd never experienced before. He'd spent his entire life wielding power like a scalpel, and now the one person he actually wanted to protect was being destroyed by someone using the same tactics he'd once ignored. He called Marcus again. "I need everything you can find on Cedric's communications. Phone records, emails, financials, everything. That's illegal without a warrant." "Then get me a warrant." "On what grounds?" Nathaniel's voice turned cold. "I don't care. Find a judge who owes us a favor. Find a prosecutor who wants a career-making case. Find something." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "You're asking me to cross lines you've never crossed before." "Good. Maybe it's time I learned how to fight dirty." While Nathaniel scrambled for legal leverage, Eveline made a decision. She called a press conference. Colin advised against it. Margaret begged her to reconsider. Every rational voice told her that engaging with a scandal only fed it oxygen. Eveline didn't care anymore. The conference took place in the hospital's modest reception area. 20 journalists showed up, most of them expecting a resignation or a tearful apology. They got neither. Eveline stood at a microphone wearing scrubs because she'd come straight from treating a patient, and her voice was steady as iron. "I'm not stepping down. I'm not apologizing for work I haven't done or crimes I didn't commit. And I'm not going to let a corrupt man destroy this hospital because his nephew finally grew a conscience." Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled notes. Eveline continued. "Lord Cedric Ashford is facing criminal charges for negligence that killed dozens of workers over 3 decades. He falsified safety reports. He bribed officials. He destroyed evidence. And when his crimes started coming to light, he fabricated a scandal to frame me as a vengeful liar. Now he's doing it again." One reporter raised a hand. "Can you prove that?" Eveline's smile was sharp. "I don't have to. His legal team will spend the next 6 months proving it for me during his trial. But while they do that, I'm going to keep running this hospital. I'm going to keep treating patients, and I'm going to let my work speak louder than his lies." She stepped away from the microphone before anyone could ask another question. The clip went viral within an hour. Nathaniel watched the press conference from his phone, standing in the middle of a construction site he'd been helping build, and felt something shift in his chest. This was the woman he'd thrown away. The one who'd stood in front of cameras and refused to flinch even when the entire world was betting on her collapse. And she was doing it without his help, without his money, without needing him at all. The realization was humbling and terrifying in equal measure. One of the workers, a man named Callum, who'd lost his father in the mines Cedric had mismanaged, walked over and handed Nathaniel a bottled water. "She's tougher than you," Callum said, nodding toward the phone. Nathaniel didn't argue. "Yeah, she is. So what are you going to do about it?" The question hung in the cold air. Nathaniel stared at the half-built structure in front of him. Another project Eveline had started, another piece of infrastructure his family should have provided generations ago. "I'm going to make sure she doesn't have to fight alone." That night, Nathaniel drove to the tobacco shop where Cedric was staying. His uncle answered the door in a bathrobe and slippers, scotch in hand, looking every bit the fallen aristocrat who still believed the world owed him deference. Nathaniel didn't wait for an invitation. He pushed past Cedric into the cramped room that smelled like stale smoke and expensive cologne gone sour. "You need to stop," Nathaniel said. Cedric closed the door slowly. "Stop what exactly?" "The investigation, the press leaks, the coordinated character assassination. All of it." His uncle took a long sip of scotch. "I have no idea what you're talking about." Nathaniel stepped closer, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "You're paying journalists to fabricate stories. You hired someone to dig up dirt on Eveline. You're orchestrating this entire disaster from a rented room because you can't accept that you lost." Cedric's expression didn't change. "Even if that were true, which I'm not admitting, what exactly do you plan to do about it? You've already destroyed my reputation. You've already testified against me. You've already handed over evidence that will likely send me to prison. What's left?" Nathaniel felt rage coil in his chest, hot and unfamiliar. I'm giving you one chance to walk away. Stop going after Eveline. Stop trying to burn down everything she's built. And I won't make your trial any worse than it already is. Cedric laughed, and the sound was bitter enough to curdle milk. You still don't understand how power works, do you? You think you can negotiate with me like we're equals. But you gave up your leverage when you decided morality mattered more than survival. He set down his glass and walked to the window, staring out at the hospital. That woman ruined you, Cedric said quietly. She made you weak, sentimental. And now you're willing to throw away centuries of legacy because you think it'll make her love you again. Nathaniel's fists clenched. This isn't about love. This is about you destroying innocent people to protect yourself. Cedric turned and his smile was cold. Innocent? She's been using you from the beginning, Nathaniel. Maybe not the way I claimed in that first letter, but she saw an opportunity and she took it. Built a hospital with your guilt money. Turned you into her personal redemption project. And you're so desperate to believe you're a good man now that you can't see you're still just a tool. The words burrowed under Nathaniel's skin because part of him wondered if they were true. Cedric saw the hesitation and pressed harder. You want to be the hero so badly you'll let her use you until there's nothing left. But when this is over, when the trial ends and the cameras move on, she'll discard you just like you discarded her. Because that's what people like us do. We survive. And survival requires knowing when someone has outlived their usefulness. Nathaniel's voice came out strangled. You're wrong, am I? Cedric picked up his scotch again. Then go ahead. Protect her. Throw yourself on the pyre for a woman who'll never fully forgive you. See how that works out. Nathaniel walked to the door, his hands shaking with suppressed violence. If you come after her again, I will destroy you in ways the court can't touch. Cedric raised his glass in mock salute. Looking forward to it. Nathaniel left the building feeling like he'd lost a fight he didn't even know how to win. He sat in his car for 20 minutes, staring at nothing, Cedric's words replaying in his mind on a vicious loop. She's been using you from the beginning. Was she? He thought about the land transfer, the donations, the months he'd spent working construction because she'd challenged him to prove he'd changed. Had any of it been real? Or had Eveline simply recognized an opportunity to extract resources from a man drowning in guilt? The doubt felt like acid. He wanted to drive to the hospital and demand the truth. Wanted to ask Eveline point blank if she'd ever actually cared about him or if he'd just been a convenient source of funding. But he didn't, because part of him was terrified of what the answer might be. The next morning, Eveline woke to find the hospital surrounded by news vans again. She dragged herself out of bed, exhaustion weighing on every muscle, and checked her phone. 17 missed calls, 43 new emails, 6 voicemails from reporters asking for comment on a story she hadn't even seen yet. She opened the first news link with a sense of dread so familiar it felt like an old friend. Breaking. Financial audit reveals potential discrepancies in Eveline Carter's hospital records. Prosecutors considering formal investigation. The article was vague on specifics but heavy on implication. Anonymous sources, alleged inconsistencies, calls for accountability. All of it designed to make her look guilty without actually providing evidence. Eveline set down her phone and stared at the ceiling, feeling the full weight of how exhausting it was to keep fighting battles someone else kept inventing. There was a knock on her door. She opened it to find Nathaniel standing in the hallway, looking like he hadn't slept in days. I need to talk to you, he said. Eveline stepped aside, too tired to argue. They sat across from each other in her small kitchen, the silence heavy with things neither of them knew how to say. Finally, Nathaniel spoke. Did you ever actually care about me? Or was I just a convenient source of funding for your hospital? Eveline's expression didn't change. Is that what you think? I don't know what to think anymore. Cedric said, Cedric is a liar. Eveline's voice was flat. He spent his entire life manipulating people, and now he's manipulating you. Again, then tell me I'm wrong. Tell me this isn't just about the money. Eveline stood up, her exhaustion turning into something sharper. You want me to prove I care about you? After you humiliated me in front of the world because you believed an anonymous letter over 7 years of loyalty? After I rebuilt my entire life from nothing while you played redemption arc? That's not fair. Nothing about this is fair, Nathaniel. Eveline's voice cracked slightly. You don't get to demand proof of my feelings while you're still questioning whether I'm using you. Either you trust me or you don't. But I'm done trying to convince you I'm not the villain your uncle keeps painting me as. Nathaniel stood, reaching for her. Eveline. She pulled away. I think you should go. Don't do this. I'm not doing anything. You are. You're letting Cedric get inside your head because it's easier to doubt me than to accept that you might actually have to fight for something without a guaranteed outcome. The words hit like a slap. Nathaniel stared at her, seeing the hurt beneath the anger, and hating himself for putting it there. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I know. Eveline walked to the door and opened it. But sorry doesn't change the fact that you still don't trust me, and I can't keep proving myself to someone who's looking for reasons to leave. Nathaniel walked out, and the door closed behind him with the finality of a coffin lid. For 3 days they didn't speak. Nathaniel threw himself into finding evidence against Cedric, working with Marcus to track financial transactions and communication records that might prove his uncle was orchestrating the smear campaign. Eveline focused on the hospital, ignoring the protesters and the news vans and the steady stream of donation cancellations. Both of them were too proud to reach out first, and Cedric watched it all with the satisfaction of a man who understood that destroying someone didn't require violence. It just required patience and the willingness to exploit the cracks already present. On the 4th day, Eveline received a letter. It arrived in a plain white envelope, slid under her office door sometime after midnight. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a typewritten message. Drop the press defense and step down from the hospital. Admit financial mismanagement, and I'll make sure the investigation ends quietly. Refuse, and I'll release information that will destroy not just your reputation, but the reputation of every patient who trusted you. You have 48 hours. It wasn't signed, but Eveline knew exactly who sent it. She read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking with rage and exhaustion, and the terrible knowledge that Cedric wasn't bluffing. He had the resources, the connections, the absolute lack of conscience required to hurt innocent people just to win. And if she didn't comply, he'd burn down everything she'd built. Eveline didn't tell anyone about the letter. Instead, she spent the next 24 hours making contingency plans. She contacted every major donor personally, explaining the situation and asking for patience. She met with the hospital board and secured emergency funding to cover operational costs if donations dried up completely. She prepared legal documents transferring temporary control to Margaret in case stepping down became unavoidable. She did everything a rational person would do when facing an impossible choice. And then she made a different decision. She called Nathaniel. He answered on the 2nd ring. Eveline? Her voice was calm. Too calm. I need you to come to the hospital, tonight. What's wrong? Just come. Please. He was there in 15 minutes. Eveline met him in her office, the letter sitting on her desk like a loaded gun. Nathaniel read it twice, his expression darkening with every word. When did you get this? Yesterday. And you're just telling me now? Eveline's smile was bitter. I wasn't sure you'd care, given that you've spent the last week wondering if I'm using you. Nathaniel flinched. I was wrong. About all of it. Cedric got in my head and I let him because I'm still terrified of making the same mistakes. He looked at her, and the exhaustion in his eyes matched hers. But I'm done letting fear make my decisions. Whatever you need, whatever it takes to fight this, I'm with you. Eveline studied him for a long moment, searching for doubt. She didn't find any. I'm not stepping down, she said quietly. Even if it means he releases whatever information he's threatening, then we fight. You understand what that means? He'll come after both of us. He'll use every dirty trick he knows. And he knows a lot of them. Nathaniel's voice was steady. I don't care. I'm not letting him win. Eveline felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but the beginning of trust being rebuilt from wreckage. Okay, she said, then we need to move fast. Done. They spent the next 6 hours planning. Marcus arrived with a forensic accountant who specialized in unraveling financial conspiracies. Colin brought a private investigator who'd worked cases against powerful people before. By dawn, they had a strategy. Step 1. Freeze Cedric's ability to access any remaining assets by filing an emergency injunction claiming he was using bail freedom to commit witness intimidation. Step 2. Trace the payments to Gerald Hutchins and the other operatives, building a paper trail that connected Cedric to the smear campaign. Step 3. Go public before Cedric could release whatever information he was threatening. It was aggressive, risky, and required perfect timing. But it was the only option that didn't involve surrender. Nathaniel looked at Eveline across the table, surrounded by lawyers and documents and the wreckage of too many battles. "You ready for this?" Eveline's smile was sharp. "I've been ready since the moment you threw me away in that ballroom. Now, let's finish it." They filed the injunction at 8 a.m. By noon, Cedric's lawyer was in court arguing against it, but the judge, an older woman who'd lost family members in mining accidents, wasn't sympathetic. She granted a temporary freeze on Cedric's financial activity pending further investigation. It was a small victory, but it cut off his ability to pay for more attacks. Step 1, complete. The forensic accountant traced Gerald Hutchins' payments to a shell company registered in the Caymans. The company had 3 board members, all of whom had financial ties to Cedric's former business ventures. It wasn't airtight proof, but it was close enough to build a case. Step 2 in progress. Then came Step 3. Nathaniel and Eveline called a joint press conference. Every major outlet showed up, expecting either a resignation or a breakdown. They got a declaration of war. Nathaniel spoke first, his voice calm and precise. "Lord Cedric Ashford is currently facing criminal charges for decades of corruption that resulted in the deaths of dozens of workers. Rather than accept responsibility, he has spent the last 2 months orchestrating a targeted harassment campaign against Eveline Carter and the hospital she built to help the communities his negligence destroyed. He laid out the evidence, the shell companies, the payments to journalists, the threatening letter." Eveline spoke next. "I'm not stepping down. I'm not apologizing for work I didn't do, and I'm not going to let a guilty man destroy innocent people just to avoid accountability. If Lord Cedric wants to fight, we'll fight, but we'll do it in court, where the truth actually matters." The room erupted with questions. Nathaniel and Eveline ignored them and walked out together, shoulder to shoulder, knowing they'd just crossed a line neither of them could uncross. Cedric received the news in his rented room, watching the press conference on a laptop that felt like it was mocking him. His lawyer called 30 seconds later, voice tight with panic. "They've frozen your accounts. They've connected you to Hutchins, and the prosecutor is talking about adding witness intimidation to the charges." Cedric didn't respond immediately. He was too busy calculating how many pieces were still on the board and how few moves he had left. Finally, he spoke. "Schedule a meeting with the prosecutor. Tell them I'm willing to negotiate." "Negotiate what?" "Whatever it takes to make this go away." He ended the call and poured himself another scotch, staring at the hospital lights across the street. Nathaniel had made his choice. Eveline had made hers, and Cedric had one last card to play. It was nuclear. It was irreversible, and it would hurt everyone involved. But if he was going down, he was taking them with him. He opened his laptop and drafted an email to every major news outlet in Britain. The subject line read, "Full confession, Duke Nathaniel Ashford's role in covering up family crimes." The message detailed everything. Nathaniel's initial involvement in protecting the family reputation, his knowledge of the mining accidents before the public confession, his personal relationship with officials who'd been bribed. Most of it was distorted. Some of it was fabricated. All of it was designed to make Nathaniel look complicit in the crimes he'd eventually exposed. If Cedric couldn't win, he'd make damn sure Nathaniel lost too. His finger hovered over the send button. Outside, the hospital lights burned steady. Inside, 2 people who'd survived betrayal were learning how to fight together. And in a rented room above a tobacco shop, a man who'd lost everything prepared to prove that some people would rather burn the world than admit they were wrong. Cedric hit send. The email detonated across British media at 4 in the morning. Nathaniel woke to the sound of his phone vibrating so violently it fell off the nightstand. He reached for it in the dark, his brain still foggy with sleep, and saw Marcus Webb's name flashing on the screen alongside 17 missed calls. He answered. "What happened?" Marcus's voice was strained in a way Nathaniel had never heard before. Cedric released a statement. "It's bad." "How bad?" "Career-ending bad. Maybe criminal bad. You need to see it now." Nathaniel pulled up the first news link his search returned and felt his stomach drop through the floor. The headline read, "Duke Nathaniel Ashford allegedly covered up family crimes for years before convenient public confession. Full evidence released by uncle facing trial." Below it was a PDF document 40 pages long, meticulously formatted to look like official legal correspondence. It detailed meetings Nathaniel had supposedly attended where mining accidents were discussed, financial transfers that allegedly showed him profiting from the cover-up, email exchanges with officials that had been selectively edited to make him look complicit in every decision Cedric had made for 3 decades. Most of it was fabricated. Some of it was real, but stripped of context. All of it was designed to make Nathaniel look like he'd been protecting the family empire right up until the moment turning on Cedric became politically convenient. The document ended with a single damning line. Nathaniel Ashford is not a reformer. He is a coward who only confessed when he realized his complicity was about to be exposed. Nathaniel read it 3 times, his hands shaking, his mind trying to process how thoroughly Cedric had just destroyed him. His phone buzzed again. Text from Eveline. "We need to talk. Now." He dressed in the dark and drove to the hospital through streets still empty except for delivery trucks, and the first stirrings of a town that had no idea the ground beneath it was about to crack open. "What?" Eveline was waiting in her office, the same PDF pulled up on her laptop, her face carved from stone. She didn't say anything when Nathaniel walked in, just turned the screen toward him, as if he hadn't already read every word. He sat down across from her, exhaustion and rage fighting for dominance in his chest. "How much of this is true?" Eveline asked, her voice eerily calm. Nathaniel looked at her, and the fact that she had to ask felt like a knife between his ribs. "Almost none of it. The meetings happened, but I was barely involved. The financial transfers were legitimate estate management. The emails are real, but edited to remove context that proves I was pushing back against Cedric's decisions, not supporting them." Eveline's expression didn't change. "So some of it is true." "Yes, but not the way he's framing it." She leaned back in her chair, studying him with the kind of clinical detachment doctors used when delivering terminal diagnoses. "Do you understand what this means?" she said. "Every news outlet in the country is going to spend the next week debating whether you're a hero who exposed corruption or a co-conspirator who only confessed to save yourself. And while they're debating, this hospital is going to get dragged through the mud again because I'm associated with you." Nathaniel felt something break inside him. "I'm sorry." "Sorry doesn't fix this." Eveline's voice was flat. "Sorry doesn't stop the donors from pulling funding or the board from demanding I cut ties with you. Sorry doesn't keep the prosecutors from deciding you're worth investigating alongside Cedric. Then tell me what you want me to do. I want you to tell me the truth." Eveline leaned forward, her eyes hard. "Were you involved in any of the cover-ups? Did you know about the falsified reports before you claim you did? Did you profit from any of this?" Nathaniel met her gaze without flinching. "No. I didn't know the full extent until Margaret brought me the evidence. I didn't profit beyond the standard inheritance every member of my family received, and I didn't cover anything up intentionally." Eveline searched his face for the lie she clearly expected to find. She didn't find one, but the fact that she'd looked for it told Nathaniel everything he needed to know about how much trust they'd actually rebuilt. "I believe you," Eveline said finally. "But belief doesn't matter anymore, perception does. And right now, the perception is that you're either a liar or an idiot who didn't notice decades of corruption happening under your nose. Both options make you a liability." The word landed like a death sentence. Nathaniel stood, his chest tight. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying you need to distance yourself from this hospital. Publicly. Before Cedric's accusations destroy everything we've built. You want me to walk away?" "I want you to protect what actually matters." Eveline's voice cracked slightly. "This isn't about us anymore. It's about 200 patients who need care and a staff that's barely holding on. If your presence here gives Cedric ammunition to shut us down, then yes, you need to walk away." Nathaniel stared at her, feeling the full weight of how thoroughly he'd been outmaneuvered. Cedric had trapped him perfectly. Stay and watch Eveline's hospital burn. Leave and prove every accusation that he only cared about appearances. There was no winning move left. "Fine," Nathaniel said quietly. "I'll release a statement stepping back from any involvement with the hospital. But I'm not stopping the legal fight against Cedric." Eveline nodded, her face unreadable. "Thank you." Nathaniel walked to the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, I meant everything I said. About changing. About fighting for this." "I know." Eveline's voice was soft and utterly exhausted. "But meaning it doesn't change the fact that you're still the same man who chose reputation over me once before. And now you're doing it again, That's not fair. Nothing about this is fair, Nathaniel. That's the point. He left before either of them could say anything else that would hurt worse than the silence already did. The statement went out at noon. It was 3 paragraphs of carefully worded legalese that amounted to Nathaniel Ashford stepping back from all. Public association with Eveline Carter's hospital while maintaining his innocence regarding his uncle's accusations. The press tore it apart immediately. Some outlets called it proof of guilt. Others called it political cowardice. A few sympathetic columnists framed it as a noble sacrifice. But their voices were drowned out by the feeding frenzy. Nathaniel watched it unfold from his rented room, feeling like he was spectating his own public execution. Marcus called with updates every hour. The prosecutors were reviewing Cedric's document. 3 members of Parliament had called for an independent investigation. 2 major donors to Nathaniel's previous reform initiatives had issued statements distancing themselves from him. Everything he'd built over the past year was collapsing in real time. And the worst part was knowing Cedric was probably sitting in his own rented room across town, drinking scotch and enjoying the show. Eveline spent the day doing damage control. She met with the hospital board and reassured them that Nathaniel's departure wouldn't affect operations. She called every major donor personally and begged them not to pull funding based on guilt by association. She spoke to staff members who were terrified the scandal would cost them their jobs. By evening, she'd managed to stabilize the immediate crisis, but the long-term damage was undeniable. 3 donors withdrew anyway. 2 nurses gave notice. The local council member who'd been calling for investigations doubled down, citing Nathaniel's involvement as proof the hospital's finances needed scrutiny. Margaret found Eveline in her office at 8 p.m., staring at spreadsheets that showed exactly how long they could survive without the lost funding. "We can make it 3 months," Eveline said quietly. "Maybe 4 if we cut staff salaries. After that, we're finished." Margaret sat down heavily. "There has to be another way." "There isn't. Not unless we find new donors or Cedric's trial happens fast enough to discredit his accusations before they become accepted truth. And if neither of those things happen," Eveline's smile was bitter, "then we close the doors and Cedric wins. Again." Across town, in a conference room that smelled like leather and old money, Cedric Ashford met with his legal team. His lead attorney, a shark in a 3,000-pound suit named Victoria Hale, sat across from him with a folder full of bad news. "The prosecutors are moving forward with the witness intimidation charges," she said. "The injunction on your assets stands, and the evidence Nathaniel provided is holding up better than we expected." Cedric sipped his scotch. "What about the document I released?" Victoria's expression was carefully neutral. "It's bought you time. The media is eating itself trying to figure out if Nathaniel's a victim or a co-conspirator, but it's not going to change the underlying case against you. That's not the point." Cedric set down his glass. "The point is to destroy his credibility before he can testify against me. If the jury thinks he's just as guilty and only turned on me to save himself, they'll discount everything he says. That's a risky strategy. Every strategy at this point is risky." Cedric leaned back. "But I'd rather go down fighting than roll over because my nephew decided to grow a conscience." Victoria closed her folder. "There's one more thing. Eveline Carter's hospital is struggling financially. If it closes in the next few months, it's going to look like your accusations had merit." "Good." Cedric's smile was cold. "Let it close. Let Nathaniel watch everything he tried to build collapse because he was too weak to protect it. That's a better punishment than anything the courts could give me." 2 weeks passed. Nathaniel stayed away from the hospital, as promised, but the absence felt like suffocation. He spent his days meeting with lawyers and his nights staring at financial statements, trying to figure out how to help Eveline without violating the distance she'd demanded. Marcus found him in the rented room on a Thursday evening, surrounded by paperwork and empty coffee cups. "You look like hell," the older man said. Nathaniel didn't argue. "What do you need?" "I need you to see this." Marcus handed him a tablet. "It's the prosecution's latest filing in Cedric's case." Nathaniel scanned the document, his pulse quickening. The prosecutors were requesting a delay, 6 months minimum. They claimed they needed additional time to investigate new evidence related to Cedric's recent accusations against Nathaniel. It was procedural, standard, and absolutely catastrophic. 6 months meant Eveline's hospital would be long dead before Cedric ever faced trial. 6 months meant the narrative would solidify around the idea that Nathaniel was complicit. 6 months meant Cedric won by default because the system moved too slowly to deliver actual justice. "We can fight it," Marcus said. "File a motion objecting to the delay. Argue that it's a stalling tactic. And if we lose, then we wait. And hope the hospital survives long enough for the truth to matter." Nathaniel set down the tablet, feeling the full weight of how thoroughly he'd been trapped. Every move he made gave Cedric ammunition. Every decision hurt someone he cared about. And the system he'd once believed in was moving too slowly to save anyone. "There has to be another option," Nathaniel said. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "There is, but you're not going to like it." And the option was simple and brutal: make a deal. If Nathaniel agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation into his own potential involvement, the prosecutors would fast-track Cedric's trial. They'd drop the delay. They'd move forward with the original timeline. It meant subjecting himself to months of invasive scrutiny. It meant admitting publicly that there was enough smoke to warrant investigation. It meant destroying any remaining credibility he had left. But it also meant Cedric faced justice before Eveline's hospital ran out of money. Nathaniel sat with the decision for 3 days, turning it over in his mind from every angle. Finally, he called Marcus. "Set up the meeting with the prosecutors." "Are you sure?" "No, but do it anyway." Automatic. The meeting took place in a windowless government office that felt designed to crush hope. 2 prosecutors sat across from Nathaniel, their faces professionally neutral, while they explained exactly what cooperation would entail. Full financial disclosure going back 15 years. Testimony under oath about every interaction with Cedric and the family business. Agreement to potential charges if evidence of wrongdoing emerged. And in exchange? In exchange, we move Cedric's trial up by 4 months. You testify. We use your cooperation as evidence that you're acting in good faith. Nathaniel's lawyer, a man named Richard Cross, leaned forward. My client needs assurances that this cooperation won't be used against him later. The lead prosecutor, a woman in her 50s named Elena Vasquez, smiled thinly. We can't make promises about what the evidence shows, but we can promise that cooperation will be noted favorably. It was the best offer Nathaniel was going to get. He signed the agreement before he could talk himself out of it. The announcement hit the news that evening. Duke Nathaniel Ashford agrees to cooperate with investigation into family corruption. Cedric Ashford's trial expedited. The headlines were predictably vicious. Half the outlets framed it as an admission of guilt. The other half called it a desperate attempt to salvage credibility. No one called it what it actually was. A man choosing to sacrifice himself so the people he'd hurt had a chance to survive. Eveline saw the news while treating a patient, and her hands faltered on the bandage she was wrapping. The patient, an elderly miner named Thomas, noticed. "You all right, Doc?" Eveline forced a smile. "Fine. Just distracted." But she wasn't fine, because she understood exactly what Nathaniel had just done and what it was going to cost him. And despite everything, despite the betrayal and the doubt and the exhaustion, she felt something crack in the armor she'd built around her heart. She found him 2 hours later, sitting on a bench outside the construction site where he'd spent months hauling lumber and learning humility. He looked up when she approached, surprise flickering across his face. "You're not supposed to be here," he said. "Neither are you." Eveline sat down beside him, leaving careful space between them. "You agreed to the investigation. It was the only way to move the trial forward. You know what this is going to do to you." Nathaniel shrugged. "I've already lost everything that mattered. What's a little more damage?" Eveline turned to look at him, and the exhaustion in his eyes matched hers. "You didn't lose everything." "Didn't I?" "You told me to leave. The hospital can't be associated with me. My reputation is destroyed. And Cedric is still out there weaponizing every mistake I've ever made. You're still here." Eveline's voice was quiet. "You're still fighting. That's more than most people do when the cost gets this high." Nathaniel laughed bitterly. "I'm not fighting. I'm just trying to minimize the collateral damage from my own stupidity. That's what fighting looks like when you've actually got something to lose." They sat in silence for a moment, the cold wind cutting through their coats while the half-built structure loomed behind them like a monument to work unfinished. "I didn't want to drag you into this," Nathaniel said finally. "Any of it. The scandal, the investigation, the fallout. You deserved better. I deserved honesty. Eveline's voice was steady. I deserved trust, and I deserved a partner who didn't assume the worst about me the moment things got complicated. I know, but you're learning. Eveline met his eyes, slowly, painfully. But you're learning. Nathaniel felt his throat tighten. I don't know if it's enough. It's not. Not yet. Eveline stood, brushing dirt from her coat. But it's a start. She walked away before he could respond, leaving him sitting alone with the realization that some forgiveness had to be earned in increments too small to measure but too important to abandon. The investigation into Nathaniel's involvement began immediately. Forensic accountants combed through 15 years of financial records. Prosecutors questioned everyone who'd ever worked with him. Every email, every meeting, every decision was scrutinized for evidence of complicity. It was invasive and humiliating and designed to uncover every mistake he'd ever made. And through it all, Nathaniel cooperated fully. He handed over the documents that made him look careless. He admitted to decisions that showed poor judgment. He testified under oath about conversations he barely remembered, but that painted him as either complicit or willfully ignorant. The press had a field day. But slowly, a different picture began to emerge. The evidence showed a man who'd been kept at arm's length from the worst decisions, who'd pushed back when he had information but hadn't known enough to stop what he couldn't see, who'd inherited a corrupt system and failed to question it until it was too late. It wasn't heroic. It wasn't even particularly noble, but it was true. And truth, Nathaniel was learning, was often just the least damaging version of failure. Cedric's trial began on a Monday in late spring. The courtroom was packed with journalists, victims' families, and legal observers who understood they were watching the dismantling of one of Britain's oldest dynasties. Cedric sat at the defense table looking every bit the aristocrat who still believed the rules didn't apply to him. Nathaniel testified on the third day. He walked to the stand knowing every eye in the room was judging whether he was a victim or an accomplice, and knowing the answer was probably both. The prosecution asked him to detail Cedric's involvement in the mining accidents, the falsified reports, the bribed officials, the decades of choosing profit over human life. Nathaniel answered every question with the kind of precision that came from months of practice and the knowledge that this was his only chance to make any of it mean something. The defense attorney, Victoria Hale, cross-examined him with surgical efficiency. Isn't it true, Mr. Ashford, that you benefited financially from the same business practices you're now condemning? Yes. And isn't it true that you had access to the same financial records you claim your uncle hid from you? I had access to summary reports, not the underlying documentation that showed the falsification. But you never asked to see that documentation, did you? Nathaniel met her eyes. No, I didn't. Because you didn't want to know. The accusation hung in the air. Nathaniel took a breath. Because I trusted the people running those operations, to be honest. That trust was misplaced. But yes, I should have asked harder questions sooner. Victoria smiled thinly. So you're either complicit or incompetent. Which is it? I'm someone who failed to protect people I should have protected. Call that whatever you want. The answer didn't satisfy anyone, but it was the only honest one Nathaniel had. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Witnesses testified about accidents that should have been prevented. Engineers explained how safety reports were altered. Families described losing fathers and brothers to negligence that had been profitable enough to ignore. Cedric's defense was textbook. Deny everything, blame subordinates, claim ignorance. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They found Cedric Ashford guilty on 14 counts of criminal negligence, conspiracy to commit fraud, and witness intimidation. The judge sentenced him to 12 years in prison. Nathaniel sat in the gallery and felt absolutely nothing. No satisfaction, no relief. Just the hollow awareness that justice had arrived too late to undo the damage. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Nathaniel pushed through them without comment, his mind already racing ahead to the question that actually mattered. Would the verdict be enough to save the hospital? It was, and it wasn't. The conviction validated everything Eveline had said about Cedric's character. It discredited his accusations against Nathaniel. It shifted public perception just enough that some donors reconsidered their withdrawals. but the hospital was still hemorrhaging money. Eveline sat in her office 2 days after the verdict, staring at spreadsheets that showed they had 6 weeks of operational funding left. Margaret knocked on the door. "We got 3 donations today. Small ones, but it's something. It's not enough." Eveline didn't look up. "We need a miracle, or we need to start preparing closure plans." There was a long silence. Then Margaret said quietly, "Nathaniel's outside. He's asking to see you." Eveline's first instinct was to say no, to maintain the distance that had kept her functional through the trial, to protect herself from hoping he'd somehow fix this. But she was too tired to keep fighting battles that didn't need to be fought. "Send him in." Nathaniel looked like he'd aged 5 years and 3 weeks. He sat down across from Eveline without preamble. "I have a solution. You're not going to like it." Eveline's expression was carefully neutral. "I'm listening." "Sell me the hospital." She blinked. "What?" "Sell it to me. For £1. Transfer ownership completely. I'll fund it through a trust that keeps my name out of the public record. You continue running operations exactly as you have been. But legally, financially, it becomes mine to sustain." Eveline's jaw tightened. "You want me to give up the one thing I built on my own so you can swoop in and save it? I want you to keep treating patients." Nathaniel's voice was steady. "I don't care who gets credit. I don't care if you never forgive me. I care that the work continues. And right now, the only way that happens is if someone with resources takes on the financial liability. This is you trying to buy redemption. This is me trying to make sure your legacy doesn't die because I destroyed your ability to fundraise." Eveline stood pacing to the window. "If I do this, people will say I was using you all along, that I manipulated you into funding my project. Let them say it." Nathaniel's voice was quiet. "I don't care anymore what people think. I care what's true. And the truth is, you built something extraordinary that deserves to survive regardless of how we got here." Eveline stared out at the town she'd spent years serving, the people who'd trusted her when no one else would, the patients who needed care more than they needed her pride. She'd spent her entire life proving she didn't need anyone, but maybe surviving meant accepting help from the last person she wanted to owe anything to. "I have conditions," she said finally. "Name them. You stay out of operations completely. No input on hiring, treatment protocols, or strategic direction. You fund it, I run it." "Agreed. And if I ever decide to buy it back from you, you sell it to me for the same £1. Nathaniel stood. "Agreed." Eveline turned to face him. "Why are you doing this?" "Because watching you lose everything while I stand by doing nothing would destroy me faster than any investigation or trial ever could." The honesty in his voice hit harder than any grand gesture. Eveline felt the last wall around her heart develop a crack she couldn't quite seal. £1, she said. "And you put it in writing that I maintain full operational control. Consider it done." Date. The paperwork took 4 days. When it was finalized, Eveline signed her name to a contract that technically made her an employee of a trust she didn't control, but practically changed nothing about how the hospital operated, except now it would survive. The announcement was handled quietly. No press conference, no grand statements, just a legal filing that transferred ownership and secured funding for the next 5 years minimum. Some outlets picked up the story and ran predictable headlines about the Duke buying his way back into his ex-fiancée's life. Eveline ignored them. She had patients to treat and a staff to reassure and work that mattered more than whatever narrative strangers wanted to construct. But late one night, after the hospital had gone quiet and the last chart was filed, she found herself standing outside the construction site where Nathaniel had spent months proving he could build instead of just inherit. He was there, sitting on the same bench, staring at the structure that was finally nearing completion. She sat down beside him. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Eveline broke the silence. "You know, this doesn't fix everything." "I know. And it doesn't mean I forgive you completely. I know that too." "Then why did you do it?" Nathaniel turned to look at her, and the exhaustion in his eyes was matched by something else, something that looked dangerously close to peace. "Because you taught me that redemption isn't something you earn in one grand gesture. It's something you build slowly over time by doing the work even when no one's watching and no one's keeping score." He stood, brushing dirt from his coat. "This hospital is the best thing I've ever been part of. Not because I funded it, but because you built it. And if spending the rest of my life making sure it survives is the only meaningful thing I ever do, that's enough." He walked away before she could respond. disappearing into the dark while Eveline sat alone with the realization that some people changed. Not because they wanted credit, but because they finally understood the cost of staying the same. And maybe that was the only kind of change that ever actually lasted. Cuts. 3 months later, the hospital opened its new wing. It was twice the size of the original building, equipped with modern surgical facilities and enough beds to serve 500 patients a year. The entire town showed up for the opening ceremony. Eveline stood at the entrance, exhausted and proud and terrified that she was one crisis away from losing everything again. But when she looked out at the crowd, miners and their families, shopkeepers and teachers, people who'd been forgotten by everyone except the woman who'd refused to let their suffering be invisible, she saw something that looked dangerously close to hope. Nathaniel stood at the back of the crowd, deliberately out of frame when the photographers took pictures. He'd kept his word, stayed out of operations, funded it quietly. Let Eveline take every ounce of credit while he rebuilt his life in the margins. But when her eyes found his across the crowd, something passed between them that didn't need words. Not forgiveness, exactly, but recognition. Two people who destroyed each other learning how to build something worth surviving for. And in a world that demanded perfection, maybe that broken, difficult, imperfect collaboration was the closest thing to redemption either of them would ever find. That night, Eveline found a letter slid under her office door. Inside was a single page in Nathaniel's handwriting. I don't expect you to love me again. I don't even expect you to like me. But I want you to know that everything I am now, everything I'm trying to become, started the moment you walked away and forced me to see who I actually was instead of who I pretended to be. You didn't save me. You showed me I was worth saving. That's a gift I'll spend the rest of my life trying to deserve. Thank you for not giving up on the work, even when you'd given up on me. N. Eveline read it twice, her hands shaking slightly. Then she folded it carefully and placed it in her desk drawer alongside legal documents and patient files and all the other evidence that survival required carrying weight no one else could see. She didn't respond, but she didn't throw it away either. And in the space between those two choices lived the possibility that some wounds healed slowly enough to leave scars worth keeping. Outside, the hospital lights burned steady against the Scottish night. Inside, 200 patients slept safely, cared for by a woman who'd learned that strength wasn't about never breaking. It was about deciding what you built from the pieces. And somewhere across town, in a room above a general store, a man who'd lost everything that didn't matter finally understood what it meant to fight for something that did. The reckoning wasn't over. It never would be. But for the first time in a year, neither of them was fighting alone. And that fragile, hard-won alliance was the only foundation strong enough to build a future neither of them could have survived on their own. The first threat arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the new wing opened. Eveline found it wedged under the hospital's front door when she arrived at dawn. A plain manila envelope with no postage, no return address, just her name typed across the front in letters that looked like they'd been hammered out on a typewriter older than she was. Inside was a single photograph. It showed Nathaniel leaving her office late at night 2 weeks prior, the timestamp visible in the corner proving he'd been there well past visiting hours. Below the image, a message in the same typewritten font. The Duke still pulls your strings. How much is he really controlling? People deserve to know the truth. Eveline's hands did not shake. She'd been threatened before. But the implication was clear. Someone was watching, documenting, and preparing to weaponize every interaction she had with Nathaniel into evidence of corruption. She pulled out her phone and called him. He answered on the first ring. What's wrong? Someone's following us, photographing us. Her voice was flat. They're building a narrative that you're secretly controlling the hospital. Silence on the other end while Nathaniel processed the information with the kind of cold precision that came from spending months under investigation. Do you still have the envelope? Yes. Don't touch it again. I'm sending Marcus with someone who can check it for prints. Nathaniel, this isn't going to stop. Eveline walked to her office window, scanning the street for anyone with a camera. Cedric's in prison, but his allies aren't. Someone wants to finish what he started. Then we finish it first. His voice carried an edge she hadn't heard before, something sharp and final that suggested he was done playing defense. I'll be there in 20 minutes. The line went dead before she could argue. Trial. Nathaniel arrived with Marcus and a woman named Claire Donnelly, who specialized in corporate espionage and threat assessment. She wore a suit that cost more than most people's monthly salary and carried herself like someone who'd seen worse than anonymous photographs. Claire examined the envelope with gloved hands, her expression unreadable. "Professional grade," she said after a moment. "The paper's generic, but the typewriter's vintage. Probably a Remington from the 70s or 80s. Whoever sent this wanted it to feel ominous." "Can you trace it?" Eveline asked. "Maybe." Claire pulled out a small UV light and scanned the envelope. "But my guess is whoever did this knows how to avoid leaving evidence. This feels like intimidation, not a prelude to legal action." Nathaniel leaned against the desk, his jaw tight. "What do they want?" Claire looked up. "Usually? Compliance. They want you scared enough to make a mistake, shut down operations, cut ties publicly, something they can use to claim vindication." Eveline's eyes narrowed. "So this is about making us look guilty. It's about controlling the narrative." Claire set down the envelope. "Cedric Ashford might be locked up, but his network isn't. My guess is someone connected to his former business interests is trying to delegitimize this hospital before it becomes a permanent symbol of his failure." Nathaniel straightened. "Can you find out who?" "I can try, but it's going to take time and it won't be cheap." "Money's not the issue." Nathaniel's voice was ice. "Time is. If they're planning something bigger than photographs, I need to know before it happens." Claire nodded and left with the envelope, promising updates within 48 hours. When she was gone, Eveline turned to Nathaniel. "This is what it's going to be like, isn't it? Every time we make progress, someone's going to try to tear it down. Probably." Nathaniel met her eyes. "But that's the cost of building something that threatens people who profit from suffering. They don't go quietly. I'm tired of fighting. I know." His voice softened slightly. "But the alternative is letting them win. And I don't think either of us can live with that." Eveline wanted to argue, wanted to say she was exhausted, and maybe surrender was the smarter option. But the part of her that had survived public humiliation and rebuilt from nothing refused to let the words form. Instead, she said, "If we're doing this, we do it smart. No reckless moves. No grand gestures that make us vulnerable." "Agreed." Nathaniel moved toward the door. "I'll have security installed by tomorrow. Cameras, alarms. Anyone comes near this place will know." "And what about you? What about me? You're as much a target as I am." Eveline's voice carried something that might have been concern. Maybe more. Nathaniel's smile was grim. "I stopped worrying about myself the day I testified. Whoever wants to come after me can get in line." He left before she could respond, his footsteps echoing down the hallway like a countdown to something neither of them could stop. 10. Claire's report arrived 36 hours later. Nathaniel read it in his rented room while rain hammered against the windows, and the town outside settled into the kind of darkness that made every shadow look like a threat. The photographs had been taken by a private investigator named Martin Voss, a former journalist with a reputation for digging up dirt on behalf of wealthy clients who wanted plausible deniability. He'd been hired through a shell company registered in the Caymans, the same financial structure Cedric had used for his previous attacks. But the money trail ended there. Whoever was funding Voss had buried their identity behind enough legal firewalls that tracing it would take months and a team of forensic accountants. Claire's assessment was blunt. Someone with significant resources wants Eveline Carter's hospital discredited. They're patient, well-funded, and willing to play the long game. Recommend immediate protective measures and assume further escalation. Nathaniel set down the report and stared at the rain. He'd spent the last year learning that power wasn't about control. It was about accepting how little control you actually had and fighting anyway. But knowing someone was out there watching, waiting, planning the next attack made every decision feel like walking through a minefield blindfolded. His phone buzzed. Text from Eveline. "We need to talk. Now." He grabbed his coat and drove through the storm to the hospital, his mind racing through possibilities that all ended badly. Eveline was waiting in her office with Margaret and Colin Reed, her lawyer. All three of them looked like they'd been arguing for hours. "What happened?" Nathaniel asked. "We received a formal inquiry from the General Medical Council," Colin said, handing him a document. "They're investigating allegations of improper patient care and financial mismanagement." Nathaniel scanned the letter, his stomach dropping. "Who filed the complaint?" "Anonymous." Colin's expression was grim. "But it's detailed enough to trigger a mandatory audit. They'll be here next week to review every patient record, every financial transaction, every staffing decision for the past 2 years. This is the next move. Eveline's voice was tight. Whoever sent those photographs is escalating. They're using official channels to bury us in bureaucracy while they build a case in public opinion. Can we fight it? Nathaniel looked at Colin. We can cooperate and hope the audit finds nothing. Colin's tone suggested he knew how naive that sounded. But if they're determined to find problems, they will. No organization this size operates perfectly. Small violations, clerical errors, judgment calls that look questionable in hindsight. It all becomes ammunition. Margaret spoke up, her voice steady despite the exhaustion in her eyes. We've run this hospital by the book. Every regulation followed, every patient treated with the highest standard of care. An honest audit won't find grounds for closure, but an audit looking for reasons to shut us down will find technicalities we can't defend against. Eveline stood, pacing to the window. This isn't about truth. It's about attrition. Their betting will collapse under the pressure before we can prove our innocence. Nathaniel watched her move, saw the tension coiled in every muscle, and felt rage settle in his chest like a living thing. He'd spent months trying to fix problems through legal channels and institutional procedures. And every time, the people with resources found ways to weaponize those same systems against the vulnerable. There was a reason power concentrated in the hands of those willing to be ruthless. Because playing by rules only worked when everyone else did too. What if we don't wait for the audit? Nathaniel said quietly. All three of them turned to look at him. What do you mean? Eveline asked. I mean, we go on offense. We find out who's funding Martin Voss. We expose them before they can finish building their case. We make it too expensive for them to keep attacking. Colin shook his head. That's dangerous. If you're wrong about who's behind this, you could trigger lawsuits for defamation. If you're right, but can't prove it, you look paranoid and give them more ammunition. Nathaniel met the lawyer's eyes. I've spent the last year watching good people get destroyed by bad actors who hide behind institutions. I'm done being reactive. If someone wants a fight, I'm bringing one to them. The room went silent. Eveline studied him with an expression that mixed wariness and something that might have been recognition. You're talking about going after people with more money and influence than you have left. People who've spent decades learning how to protect themselves. I know. You could lose everything. I already did. Nathaniel's voice was steady. Now I'm just deciding what I'm willing to burn down to protect what matters. Eveline held his gaze for a long moment, weighing the risk against the alternative. Finally, she said, if we do this, we do it together. No lone hero bullshit, no sacrificing yourself to save me. We're partners or we're nothing. Nathaniel felt something shift in his chest. Not quite forgiveness, but the beginning of the trust they'd spent months rebuilding. Partners, he agreed. Shit. The investigation into Martin Voss began that night. Claire Donnelly returned with a team of researchers who specialized in unraveling shell companies and offshore accounts. They worked out of Nathaniel's rented room, turning it into a makeshift operations center filled with laptops and financial documents, and the kind of focused intensity that came from hunting people who thought they were untouchable. By dawn, they had 3 leads. The first connected Voss to a consulting firm that specialized in reputation management for industrial clients. The second linked that firm to a consortium of mining companies who'd lost contracts after Cedric's conviction made their industry practices subject to public scrutiny. The third showed that same consortium had hired lobbyists to fight new safety regulations that Eveline's hospital had been publicly advocating for. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was a pattern. Claire laid out the evidence on Nathaniel's makeshift desk. These companies have billions at stake. If Eveline's hospital becomes a symbol of reform, it threatens their entire business model. Discrediting her prevents the narrative from spreading, so they hired Voss to build a case that she's corrupt. Nathaniel stared at the connections Claire had mapped out. And they're using the GMC audit to give it official legitimacy. Exactly. Claire's expression was grim. But here's the problem. We can't prove they coordinated the complaint. The paper trail's too clean. We can show they had motive and hired someone with the skills to execute this kind of attack, but that's circumstantial. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Then we make them react. We release what we have publicly and force them to either deny involvement or double down. Either way, it shifts attention to them. That's risky. If they're smart, they'll just ignore it and let the audit do the damage. Maybe. Nathaniel looked at the evidence again, his mind racing through scenarios. But if we're loud enough, we force the GMC to investigate whether the complaint was made in good faith. And if we can prove bad faith, the audit becomes tainted. Claire considered it. You'd need more than we have. You'd need someone willing to go on record saying they were pressured to file false complaints, or someone inside the consortium admitting the strategy. Then we find them. Nathaniel stood, exhaustion replaced by the kind of clarity that came from finally having a target. Martin Voss has worked for these people before. He knows where the bodies are buried. We lean on him until he gives us something we can use. And how exactly do you plan to lean on a professional investigator who's been doing this for 20 years? Nathaniel's smile was cold. By reminding him that everyone has something they don't want exposed, including him. Martin Voss lived in a modest flat in Edinburgh, the kind of place that suggested a man who made decent money but didn't flaunt it. Nathaniel arrived unannounced at 7 in the morning with Claire and a folder full of information about Voss's career that made it clear they'd done their homework. Voss answered the door in pajamas and a bathrobe, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm when he recognized Nathaniel. "Mr. Ashford." His voice was carefully neutral. "I'm not sure what you think you're doing here, but we need to talk." Nathaniel didn't wait for an invitation, pushing past him into the flat. "About who hired you to photograph me and Eveline Carter, and about the GMC complaint that conveniently appeared 2 days after you started surveillance." Voss closed the door slowly, his mind clearly racing through options. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do." Claire set the folder on his kitchen table and opened it. "You were hired by a shell company called Meridian Consulting Group. That company is funded by a consortium of mining interests who have every reason to want Eveline Carter's hospital discredited. You've done work for them before. 3 years ago, you helped them bury a safety violation complaint. Last year, you discredited a union organizer trying to improve working conditions." Voss's expression didn't change. "Even if that were true, attorney-client privilege protects my work. Not when that work involves filing false complaints with regulatory bodies." Nathaniel stepped closer, his voice dropping. "You fabricated evidence to trigger a GMC audit. That's not investigation. That's conspiracy. You can't prove that. Not yet." Claire's smile was sharp. "But we don't need to prove it to destroy you. We just need to release what we already have, the pattern of your work, the clients you've served, the timing of your surveillance. Public opinion will do the rest." Voss's jaw tightened. "That's extortion." "No." Nathaniel's voice was ice. "It's the same tactic you've been using against Eveline for weeks. I'm just better funded and less patient." The room went silent while Voss calculated his options. Finally, he said, "What do you want?" "The name of whoever hired you, proof that they coordinated the GMC complaint, and a sworn statement that you were pressured to fabricate evidence." Voss laughed bitterly. "You're asking me to commit professional suicide. I'm asking you to decide whether you'd rather destroy your career on your terms or have us do it for you." Nathaniel leaned against the counter. "You've got 24 hours to choose." Voss made his choice in 12. He called Claire that afternoon and agreed to meet at a neutral location, a coffee shop in Glasgow where they could talk without being observed. Nathaniel and Claire arrived early, scanning the room for anyone who might be watching. Voss showed up 10 minutes late, looking like a man who hadn't slept. He sat down across from them and slid a USB drive across the table. Everything's on there. Emails coordinating the surveillance, instructions to photograph specific interactions between you and Carter, and a recorded conversation where someone from Meridian explicitly told me to find grounds for a GMC complaint, whether the evidence supported it or not. Nathaniel picked up the drive. "Who gave you the instructions?" Voss hesitated. "Her name is Victoria Hale." The name hit like a fist. Victoria Hale, Cedric's defense attorney. The woman who'd cross-examined Nathaniel during the trial with surgical precision. The one person who had intimate knowledge of every vulnerability in Nathaniel's credibility and every weakness in Eveline's position. "She's supposed to be representing Cedric," Nathaniel said slowly. "She is." Voss's voice was flat. "But she's also on retainer for the mining consortium. Has been for years. Cedric's trial damaged her reputation. She's rebuilding it by destroying yours." Claire's expression darkened. "That's a massive conflict of interest. If Cedric knew she was working against his nephew while defending him, he probably did." Voss stood. "Cedric Ashford doesn't care who wins as long as someone loses." He gave Hale permission to burn you both if it meant salvaging something from the wreckage. Nathaniel felt rage settle in his chest like molten iron. How much of the GMC complaint is fabricated? All of it. Voss wouldn't meet his eyes. There are no legitimate grounds for an audit. We manufactured concerns based on isolated incidents taken out of context. And you were willing to destroy a hospital that treats hundreds of patients because someone paid you? Voss's smile was bitter. I was willing to do my job. Same as you did for years when you ignored what your family was built on. Don't lecture me about morality, Mr. Ashford. You're just as compromised as the rest of us. The accusation landed hard because it was true. Nathaniel took the USB drive and stood. This conversation's over. But if Hale comes after us again, I'm releasing everything, including your role in it. Voss didn't respond. He just sat there looking like a man who'd sold pieces of himself for so long he'd forgotten what was left. Begang. Nathaniel and Claire returned to Invermar that night and immediately brought the evidence to Colin Reed. The lawyer listened to the recordings, read the emails, and sat back in his chair with an expression that mixed vindication and fury. This is enough to get the GMC complaint dismissed, he said, and possibly enough to disbar Victoria Hale if we pursue it aggressively. We pursue it. Nathaniel's voice was final. She tried to destroy Eveline's hospital to rebuild her own reputation. That ends now. Colin nodded. I'll file a motion with the GMC first thing tomorrow. But you need to understand, Hale won't go down quietly. She's got connections, resources, and no moral boundaries. The moment we move against her, she'll retaliate. Let her. Nathaniel's expression was carved from stone. I'm done being afraid of people who weaponize institutions for personal gain. What then? The motion was filed at 9 a.m. the next morning. By noon, Victoria Hale had issued a public statement denying all allegations and threatening defamation lawsuits against anyone who repeated them. By evening, 3 major news outlets had picked up the story, framing it as a battle between a disgraced duke trying to protect his ex-fiancée and a respected attorney defending her professional reputation. Public opinion split down predictable lines, but the evidence was damning enough that the GMC announced an internal review of how the complaint had been filed. It was a small victory, but it was enough to delay the audit and shift momentum. Nathaniel sat in Eveline's office that night, watching her review patient charts with the same meticulous focus she brought to everything. We bought ourselves time, he said, but Hale's not done. I know. Eveline didn't look up. She's going to come after us harder now. More accusations, more fabricated evidence. She'll try to bury us before the GMC finishes their review. Nathaniel watched her work, saw the exhaustion carved into every line of her face, and felt something harden in his chest. He'd spent his entire life avoiding confrontation, playing politics, trying to preserve reputation and institutional standing. But there was a clarity that came from having nothing left to lose, a freedom in knowing that survival required becoming the kind of person you'd once feared. What if we don't wait for her next move? Nathaniel said quietly. Eveline finally looked up. What are you thinking? I'm thinking Victoria Hale built her career on destroying people through legal technicalities and reputation warfare. But she's never faced someone willing to fight the same way. You want to go after her directly. I want to make it too expensive for her to keep attacking. Nathaniel leaned forward. She's got clients, a professional reputation, partnerships that depend on her appearing ethical. We expose the conflict of interest. We release the recordings. We make her the story instead of us. That's scorched earth. Eveline's voice was careful. You're talking about destroying someone's entire career. I'm talking about protecting 200 patients from someone who sees them as collateral damage. Nathaniel met her eyes. You taught me that some fights don't end until one side can't get up anymore. This is that fight. Eveline studied him for a long moment, searching for the man who'd once chosen reputation over principle. She didn't find him. In his place was someone harder, someone who'd learned that mercy only worked when the other side had a conscience. Okay, she said finally. But we do this smart. No emotional decisions, no mistakes she can exploit. Agreed. They spent the next hour planning the offensive with the kind of cold precision that would have terrified the people they used to be. And somewhere in Edinburgh, Victoria Hale sat in her office reviewing her own strategy, confident that 2 damaged people couldn't possibly threaten someone with her resources and connections. She was about to learn how wrong she was, because power wasn't about who had the most money or the best reputation. It was about who was willing to sacrifice everything to protect what mattered. And Nathaniel Ashford had finally figured out what that actually meant. Deepening. The first strike came 48 hours later. Colin Reid filed a formal ethics complaint with the Law Society of Scotland, alleging Victoria Hale had violated professional conduct rules by representing conflicting interests and coordinating attacks on a client's adversary while still claiming to defend that client. The complaint included transcripts of Voss's recordings, emails showing coordination between Hale and the mining consortium, and evidence that she'd knowingly filed false regulatory complaints. It was meticulously documented, legally airtight, and absolutely devastating. Hale's response was immediate and vicious. She held a press conference denying everything, claiming Nathaniel had fabricated evidence in a desperate attempt to deflect from his own corruption. She threatened criminal charges for defamation. She called him a man so consumed by guilt, he'd become willing to destroy innocent people to rebuild his shattered reputation. The performance was flawless, but it had one fatal flaw. She underestimated how thoroughly they documented her involvement. Claire Donnelly released a second round of evidence that afternoon, financial records showing payments from the mining consortium to Hale's firm for services unrelated to Cedric's defense. Bank statements proving she'd been on retainer for companies actively lobbying against hospital safety reforms. Phone records demonstrating contact with Voss during the exact period he was conducting surveillance. The media turned on her within hours. Outlets that had initially defended her professionalism began questioning whether she'd crossed ethical lines. Legal analysts debated whether her actions constituted witness tampering or conspiracy. Former clients started reviewing their cases, wondering if she'd been playing both sides all along. Nathaniel watched it unfold from the hospital, feeling no satisfaction. Just the grim awareness that destroying someone required the same ruthlessness they'd weaponized against others. Eveline stood beside him, her expression unreadable. "You okay?" she asked quietly. "No." Nathaniel's voice was flat. "But I'll live with it if it means she can't hurt anyone else. That's the cost." Eveline's tone carried hard-won understanding. "Protecting people sometimes means becoming what you hate." Nathaniel turned to look at her. "Do you think I've become that?" "I think you've become someone who understands there are worse things than getting your hands dirty." Her eyes held his. "The question is whether you can live with who you had to become to win." Before Nathaniel could answer, his phone rang. Marcus Webb's name flashed on the screen. He answered, "Talk to me." Marcus's voice was tight. "Victoria Hale just filed a countersuit. She's alleging conspiracy, defamation, and intentional interference with her business relationships. She's asking for $10 million in damages." Nathaniel's grip on the phone tightened. "Can she win?" "Maybe. If she can prove you knowingly released false information or coordinated the attack to destroy her career rather than defend yourself." "We release the truth as you know it." Marcus paused. "But if she finds a witness willing to say you pressured Voss into lying or fabricated the recordings, this gets complicated fast." Nathaniel's mind raced through possibilities. "She doesn't have that. We vetted everything. You vetted what Voss gave you. You don't know what else he might have kept, or who else she's been talking to." The implication settled like ice water in Nathaniel's veins. He hung up and turned to Eveline. "Hale's fighting back. She's claiming we fabricated evidence, did we?" "No. But if she finds someone willing to lie for her, it won't matter." Eveline's jaw tightened. "Then we find them first." The hunt for Victoria Hale's next move consumed the following week. Claire's team worked around the clock, tracking Hale's communications and monitoring anyone connected to the case. They flagged 3 people who'd had recent contact with her and might be vulnerable to pressure: a junior associate at her firm who'd been present during meetings with the mining consortium, a paralegal who'd helped draft the GMC complaint, and Martin Voss himself. Nathaniel focused on Voss. If Hale was going to manufacture a counter-narrative, she'd need someone with credibility. Voss had already provided evidence against her, but he was also a professional investigator who understood how to craft stories. If she offered him enough money or legal protection, he might recant his testimony and claim Nathaniel had coerced him. Nathaniel called Claire. "Where's Voss now?" "Edinburgh. Same flat. He's been quiet since we met with him. Keep eyes on him. If Hale approaches him, I want to know immediately." "Understood." 2 days later, Claire called back. "We've got movement. Hale's assistant made contact with Voss this morning. They're meeting tomorrow afternoon at a restaurant downtown." Nathaniel's pulse quickened. Can you record it? Already working on it. But you need to understand, if we get caught surveilling their conversation, everything we've built falls apart. Then don't get caught. Ta! The meeting between Hale and Voss took place in a quiet bistro that catered to business lunches and confidential conversations. Claire had positioned a team member at a nearby table with audio equipment disguised as a laptop bag. The quality wasn't perfect, but it was good enough to capture the essentials. Nathaniel listened to the playback that night, his stomach tightening with every word. Hale's voice was smooth and persuasive. Mr. Voss, I understand you've been under considerable pressure. Duke Ashford can be very convincing when he wants something. Voss's response was cautious. I gave him the truth. Did you? Or did you give him a version of events that he wanted to hear? Hale's tone sharpened slightly. Because I have evidence suggesting the recordings you provided were edited. That key context was removed to make my communications appear more damaging than they actually were. That's not true, isn't it? How much did Ashford pay you, Mr. Voss? How many threats did he make to ensure your cooperation? The recording went quiet for a moment. Then Voss said, What are you offering? Hale's smile was audible. Legal representation, financial compensation for any damages you've suffered as a result of Ashford's coercion, and a guarantee that when this is over, your professional reputation will be intact. And in exchange, you provide an affidavit stating that Duke Ashford pressured you into fabricating evidence against me, that he threatened to destroy your career if you didn't comply, that the recordings were manipulated to serve his agenda. Another pause. I need time to think about it. You have 24 hours. After that, my offer expires and you face the consequences of your choices alone. The recording ended. Nathaniel set down the device, rage and desperation fighting for dominance. She's trying to flip him, Claire said unnecessarily. If he signs that affidavit, it becomes your word against his. And juries love the narrative of a powerful man bullying a working-class investigator. We can't let that happen. Then you need to give Voss a reason to stay loyal. Money, protection, or fear. Pick one. Nathaniel thought about the man he'd been a year ago. The one who would have chosen money, paid Voss off quietly, and hoped the problem disappeared. That man was gone. I'll handle it, Nathaniel said. He found Voss that night, sitting in a pub 3 blocks from his flat, drinking whiskey like it was the last honest thing left in the world. Nathaniel slid into the booth across from him without asking permission. Voss looked up, unsurprised. I wondered when you'd show up. You met with Hale? I did. And? Voss took a long drink. She made me an offer. A good one. I'm sure she did. Nathaniel's voice was calm. Let me make you a better one. I'm listening. You testify truthfully about what Hale asked you to do. You refused to sign her affidavit. And in exchange, I guarantee your legal fees are covered if she comes after you. I provide security if she tries to intimidate you. And when this is over, I make sure you never have to work for people like her again. Voss laughed bitterly. That's not better. That's the same thing dressed up in moral language. No. Nathaniel leaned forward. Hale's offering you money to lie. I'm offering you protection to tell the truth. The difference is what you have to live with afterward. Voss stared into his glass. You really think the truth matters? In a system where people like Hale always find ways to win? I think it's the only thing that does. Nathaniel's voice hardened. I spent 30 years ignoring the truth because it was convenient. It cost people their lives, their families, their futures. I'm not making that mistake again. And neither are you. Voss looked up, searching Nathaniel's face for the con. He didn't find one. 24 hours, Voss said quietly. That's what she gave me. I'll have an answer by then. Make it the right one. Nathaniel stood and walked out, leaving Voss alone with a choice that would define everything that came next. Psht. Voss made his decision at dawn. He called Claire and said 3 words. I'm staying loyal. The affidavit he provided instead was devastating to Hale's defense. It detailed her explicit instructions to fabricate evidence, her coordination with the mining consortium, and her attempt to coerce him into perjury. It included dates, times, and communications that corroborated everything Nathaniel had claimed. Colin Reed filed it with the Law Society that morning, along with a supplemental complaint that included recordings of Hale's meeting with Voss. The legal community erupted. Three of Hale's partners issued statements distancing themselves from her actions. Two major clients terminated their contracts. The Law Society announced an expedited investigation that carried the potential for disbarment. Victoria Hale's career was imploding in real time. But she wasn't finished. That afternoon, she released a statement so incendiary it dominated every news cycle in Britain. Duke Nathaniel Ashford has spent the past year manipulating public sympathy while hiding his true nature. A man who profited from corruption, betrayed the woman he claimed to love, and now seeks to destroy anyone who threatens to expose his complicity. Eveline Carter is not his victim. She is his accomplice. Together, they have built a hospital funded by guilt money and sustained through intimidation. I will not be silenced by threats or fabricated evidence. The truth will emerge, and when it does, both of them will face justice. The statement included no evidence, just accusations polished to a mirror shine and deployed with the precision of someone who understood that in the court of public opinion, perception mattered more than proof. Eveline read it in her office, her hands shaking with rage she couldn't quite contain. Nathaniel stood beside her, watching her process the latest attack. "She's desperate," he said quietly. "This is what losing looks like. It doesn't feel like losing." Eveline's voice was tight. "It feels like she's burning everything down because she knows she can't win." "That's exactly what she's doing." Nathaniel turned to face her, "which means the next 72 hours are going to be brutal. She's going to throw everything she has at us. More accusations, more fabricated scandals, anything to shift attention away from her own collapse. So what do we do?" Eveline met his eyes, and in that moment, they both understood that the fight had moved beyond legal strategy or public relations. This was survival, raw and uncompromising. "We finish it," Eveline said. "Whatever it takes." Nathaniel felt something final settle in his chest. The last piece of the man he used to be burning away to make room for whoever he was becoming. "Whatever it takes," he agreed, and in that quiet office, surrounded by patient charts and the weight of 200 lives depending on them, two people who'd been destroyed and rebuilt made a choice that would define everything that came next. They would fight, not for reputation or legacy or vindication, but for the simple, brutal right to exist without being destroyed by people who valued power over principle. The war was no longer about winning. It was about making sure Victoria Hale understood that some battles weren't worth starting, because the people she'd underestimated had already lost everything that made them vulnerable. And there was nothing more dangerous than someone with nothing left to lose and everything worth protecting. Across town, Victoria Hale sat in her office, reviewing her next move, confident that two damaged people couldn't possibly survive what was coming. She was about to discover how wrong she was, because the reckoning she'd spent weeks avoiding was finally arriving, and this time there would be no escape. The final confrontation didn't come with sirens or spectacle. It arrived on a gray Thursday morning when the Law Society of Scotland released their findings in a document so thorough it read like an autopsy of a career already dead. Victoria Hale was disbarred effective immediately. The ruling cited 17 separate violations of professional conduct, including conspiracy, witness tampering, fabrication of evidence, and conflict of interest so egregious it bordered on criminal. The Society recommended criminal prosecution. 3 of her former clients filed civil suits within hours. Her law firm issued a statement severing all ties and promising full cooperation with ongoing investigations. Nathaniel read the decision in his rented room while rain streaked the windows and the town outside went about its business, unaware that a war had just ended. He felt nothing. No triumph. No satisfaction. Just the hollow awareness that destroying someone required becoming comfortable with cruelty dressed up as justice. His phone buzzed. Text from Eveline. "It's over. Come to the hospital." He drove through streets slick with rain, past shops opening for the day and workers heading to shifts in mines that were marginally safer now. Because people had fought for regulations instead of accepting that suffering was the cost of employment. The world looked exactly the same as it had yesterday, but something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface where power lived and moved and occasionally got dragged into daylight. Eveline was waiting in her office with Colin Reed and Margaret. All 3 of them looked exhausted in the way that came from battles that lasted so long, you forgot what peace felt like. "The GMC dropped their investigation," Colin said without preamble. "They issued a formal apology for pursuing a complaint filed in bad faith. The hospital's reputation is clean." Margaret added, "We've had 6 donation calls this morning. People who pulled funding are asking how to restore it. Eveline sat behind her desk, her hands folded in front of her, her expression unreadable. Nathaniel looked at her, searching for the emotion he expected. Relief? Vindication? Anything that suggested winning mattered. Instead, she looked like someone who'd survived a war but couldn't quite remember why the fight had been necessary. "Can I have a moment with Nathaniel?" Eveline asked quietly. Colin and Margaret exchanged glances but left without argument. When the door closed, silence filled the space between them, like smoke from a fire finally extinguished. "We won," Nathaniel said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "Did we?" Eveline's voice was flat. "Victoria Hale is destroyed. Her career is over. She'll probably face criminal charges. We did that. She tried to destroy us first." "I know." Eveline looked down at her hands. But somewhere along the way, fighting back turned into something else. We became people willing to obliterate another human being to protect what we built. That's not victory. That's just survival with better press coverage. The observation cut deep because it was true. Nathaniel had spent months learning how to fight, and in the process had discovered a capacity for ruthlessness that terrified him precisely because it had felt so natural. Power wasn't something you wielded carefully. It was something that changed you in the wielding until you couldn't remember who you'd been before you learned how to hurt people efficiently. "What do you want me to say?" Nathaniel asked. "I want you to tell me we didn't become exactly what we were fighting against." Nathaniel walked to the window, staring out at the hospital courtyard where patients sat in wheelchairs getting fresh air and nurses moved between. Buildings carrying supplies, and the ordinary machinery of care continued regardless of the battles fought in its name. "We're not the same," he said finally. "Cedric destroyed people for profit. Hale destroyed them for reputation. We fought because the alternative was letting them win. The difference is what we're protecting." "Is it?" Eveline stood, crossing to stand beside him. "Or are we just better at justifying it?" The question hung between them, unanswerable and essential. "I don't know," Nathaniel admitted, "but I know that 200 patients are getting care they wouldn't have if we'd surrendered. I know that safety regulations got passed because this hospital became a symbol worth protecting. I know that sometimes the cost of doing the right thing is becoming someone you don't entirely recognize. And you're okay with that?" "No." Nathaniel turned to face her. "But I'm learning to live with it. Because the alternative is going back to being the man who chose comfort over conscience. And I can't be that person anymore." Eveline studied him with eyes that had seen him at his worst and his most desperate and every messy iteration in between. The woman who'd loved him once was gone, burned away by public humiliation and rebuilt into something harder. But standing there in the morning light with rain drumming against glass, and the weight of what they'd survived pressing down on both of them, something fragile and new existed in the space where that love used to be. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even entirely trust. But it was recognition. Two people who'd destroyed each other, learning how to exist in proximity without flinching. "What happens now?" Eveline asked. "Now we figure out how to live with what we became to survive." Nathaniel's voice was quiet, and we try to make sure the damage we did actually meant something. Holt. The weeks that followed felt like learning how to walk after a catastrophic injury. The hospital stabilized. Funding returned. The new wing operated at full capacity, treating patients who'd spent years being told their health wasn't worth investing in. On paper, everything looked like success. But Nathaniel couldn't shake the feeling that he'd traded one kind of corruption for another. He'd destroyed Victoria Hale using the same institutional weapons she'd tried to deploy against him. He'd threatened Martin Voss into compliance. He'd weaponized legal systems and media coverage and financial pressure with the kind of precision that would have made Cedric proud. The realization sat in his chest like a stone he couldn't cough up. He spent his days working construction on community projects funded by the trust he'd established. Physical labor that left him exhausted enough to sleep without dreaming. He avoided social events, declined interviews, turned down invitations to speak at reform conferences where people wanted to hear how a duke had found his conscience, because the truth was messier than any narrative they'd accept. He hadn't found his conscience. He'd just redirected his capacity for ruthlessness toward targets he could justify. Marcus found him 3 weeks after Hale's disbarment, sitting on the bench outside the construction site where he'd spent a year learning humility. "You're brooding," the older man said, sitting down uninvited. "I'm thinking, same thing for you." Marcus pulled out a folder. The estate managers want to know your plans. Several properties need decisions. The trust requires oversight. You can't hide in manual labor forever. Watch me. Marcus sighed. Nathaniel, you did what was necessary. Victoria Hale made her choices. The consequences are hers to carry. I destroyed her. She tried to destroy a hospital full of innocent patients to rebuild her reputation. You stopped her. That's not the same as what Cedric did, isn't it? Nathaniel turned to look at him. I used money and connections and institutional leverage to obliterate someone who threatened me. The fact that my target deserved it doesn't change the mechanism. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that landed like a physical blow. Your uncle spent his entire life telling himself that everyone he hurt deserved it, that the workers who died were careless, that the families who suffered were acceptable losses, that the system justified the cruelty. You're not him because you're asking the question. He never did. The distinction felt too small to matter, but it was all Nathaniel had to hold on to. Eveline spent those same weeks rebuilding the hospital's operations with the kind of focused intensity that left no room for reflection. She hired additional staff, expanded treatment programs, established partnerships with medical schools to bring in resident physicians who could learn rural medicine while serving communities that needed them. On the surface, she was thriving, but Margaret noticed the way Eveline stayed late every night, finding work that didn't need immediate attention, the way she avoided going home to an empty apartment, the way she smiled at patients but seemed to be performing an emotion she no longer felt. One evening, Margaret found her in the office at 9 p.m. reviewing supply orders that could have waited until morning. You're running from something, the older woman said. Eveline didn't look up. I'm working. You're hiding. Same thing your Duke does with his construction projects. He's not my Duke, isn't he? Margaret sat down. You went to war together. You rebuilt something worth protecting. You survived people trying to destroy you. That creates bonds most marriages don't have. It also creates damage most marriages don't survive. Margaret's expression softened. What are you afraid of? Eveline finally looked up, exhaustion and honesty warring in her eyes. I'm afraid that if I stop moving, I'll have to face the fact that I became someone I don't recognize. Someone who was willing to destroy another human being and call it justice. Someone who weaponized institutions the same way they were weaponized against me. You fought back. That's not the same as what they did to you. Everyone says that. Eveline's voice cracked slightly. But where's the line, Margaret? At what point does self-defense become revenge? When does protecting yourself turn into enjoying the power to hurt people who threaten you? The questions echoed the same ones Nathaniel had been wrestling with. Maybe there isn't a clean line, Margaret said quietly. Maybe you just have to live with the fact that surviving sometimes requires becoming someone you wouldn't have chosen to be. And then you decide whether that person is someone you can forgive. The conversation neither of them wanted to have finally happened on a Sunday evening when the hospital was quiet and the town outside had settled into the kind of peace that only existed in places where everyone knew everyone else's pain. Nathaniel showed up at Eveline's office with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of someone who'd finally run out of ways to avoid the inevitable. We need to talk, he said. I know. Eveline accepted the coffee and gestured to the chair across from her desk. I've been avoiding it too. Nathaniel sat, and for a long moment they just looked at each other. 2 people who'd survived battles that should have destroyed them and weren't sure what survival actually meant. I don't know how to do this, Nathaniel said finally. How to be the person who did what we did, and also the person who's supposed to have learned something from it. Neither do I. Eveline's voice was quiet. I keep waiting to feel relieved that we won, but mostly I just feel tired. Because winning required becoming people we're not sure we want to be. Eveline nodded. I spent years being the woman who got publicly humiliated and rebuilt herself through integrity and hard work. That story made sense. But the story where I systematically destroy someone's career using the same tactics they used against me? That's harder to frame as heroic. It's not heroic. Nathaniel met her eyes. It's just what survival looks like when you're fighting people who don't believe in fair fights. The honesty hung between them, ugly and necessary. Do you regret it? Eveline asked. Nathaniel considered the question. Destroying Hale? No. She would have buried us and hundreds of patients would have lost access to care. But do I regret discovering I'm capable of that kind of calculated cruelty? Every day. That's the cost. Eveline set down her coffee. We protected something worth protecting, but we had to become people we're not entirely proud of to do it. And now we have to figure out how to live with that. Can you? Live with it? I don't know yet. Eveline's smile was small and sad. Ask me in a year when the adrenaline's worn off, and I'm just left with the memory of how easily I weaponized institutions against someone I decided deserved it. Nathaniel felt his chest tighten. I never wanted this for you. Any of it. The scandal, the attacks, the fights. You deserved better. Maybe. But I got you instead. Eveline's tone wasn't accusatory, just factual. And you got a woman who refused to stay broken when you tried to discard her. We're both stuck with people who became harder and more complicated than the versions we fell in love with. Do you still love me? The question escaped before Nathaniel could stop it, raw and desperate. Eveline was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she said, I don't know if what I feel now is love. It's too tangled up with anger and respect and exhaustion and the knowledge that you're the only person who understands what we went through. But I know I don't want to do this without you. Whatever this is, it wasn't a declaration. It wasn't even particularly romantic, but it was honest in a way that mattered more than grand gestures ever could. I'll take that, Nathaniel said quietly. However long it takes to figure out what comes next. Years, probably. Eveline's voice carried the weight of someone who'd stopped believing in easy fixes. Maybe forever. Some damage doesn't heal. It just becomes part of who you are. Then we'll be damaged together. Eveline's smile was small but real. That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me. 3 months later, the hospital held a community event celebrating its second anniversary. The entire town showed up. Miners and their families, shopkeepers, teachers, people who'd spent their lives being invisible to everyone except the woman who'd refused to let their suffering be acceptable collateral damage. Eveline stood at the entrance greeting every single person by name, while Nathaniel worked the crowd with the kind of genuine humility that came from being publicly destroyed and rebuilt in full view, of people who'd seen him at his worst. He didn't make speeches, didn't seek recognition, just helped set up tables and served food, and listened to stories from people whose lives had been shaped by decisions made in boardrooms they'd never see. Late in the afternoon, an elderly miner named Thomas approached him carrying a worn photograph. This was my son, he said, holding out the picture. Died in the Blackthorn mine collapse 29 years ago. He was 19. Nathaniel looked at the photograph. A young man with his whole life ahead of him, smiling in work clothes that were cleaner than they'd ever be again. I'm sorry, Nathaniel said, the words feeling catastrophically inadequate. Your family killed him. Thomas's voice was steady, not accusatory but factual. They knew the safety reports were falsified. They chose profit over lives. And my boy paid the price. Nathaniel felt his throat close. You're right. There's nothing I can say that changes that. No, there isn't. Thomas took back the photograph. But you're here, working, building things that help people instead of just extracting value from them. That doesn't bring him back. But it means something. He walked away before Nathaniel could respond, leaving him standing in the middle of a celebration feeling the full weight of debts that could never be repaid, only acknowledged and carried. Eveline found him an hour later, sitting alone on a bench watching the sun set behind the hills. She sat beside him without speaking. Finally, Nathaniel said, I met someone whose son died in one of our mines. 29 years ago. He was 19. What did you say? That I was sorry. It wasn't enough. It never is. Eveline's voice was quiet. But it's all we have. Acknowledgement. Work that tries to prevent the same thing from happening to someone else. The knowledge that we can't fix the past, but we can stop repeating it. Nathaniel turned to look at her. How do you do it? Carry the weight of everything that went wrong and still keep moving forward? Eveline was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I don't carry it alone anymore. That helps. She took his hand. The gesture was simple, almost casual, but it carried the weight of everything they'd survived and everything they'd become in the surviving. Nathaniel squeezed her fingers, feeling something in his chest that might have been the beginning of peace. Not absolution, not forgiveness for all the ways he'd failed, but acceptance that some damage became part of who you were and you learned to build a life around the scars. We're going to be okay, he said quietly. Eventually. Eventually, Eveline agreed, and in the meantime, We just keep working. The years that followed were quieter than the ones that came before. The hospital expanded twice more, eventually serving 11 counties and becoming a model for rural healthcare reform across Britain. Eveline's name appeared on policy proposals and medical journals. She testified before Parliament about funding structures and patient advocacy. She became someone whose opinion mattered in rooms where decisions affected millions. Nathaniel stayed in Invermar. He dissolved the duchy's remaining industrial holdings and redirected the wealth into community development trusts managed by people who actually lived in the places being served. He worked construction, taught policy classes at the local college, showed up at town meetings and listened more than he spoke. He never returned to London society, never tried to reclaim the status he'd lost. Just built a life in the margins where survival required actual work instead of inherited privilege. And slowly, incrementally, he and Eveline rebuilt something that looked less like their original relationship and more like a partnership, forged in the kind of fire that either destroyed you or transformed you into something capable of surviving heat. They didn't live together, didn't get married, didn't make grand public declarations about their relationship, but they were together in the ways that mattered, working side by side, making decisions collaboratively, fighting about budgets and strategy and whose turn it was to deal with difficult board members, building a life that was messy and complicated and real in ways that the polished version from 7 years ago had never been. On the 5th anniversary of the hospital's opening, Eveline stood in the same courtyard where she'd once watched Nathaniel sit alone processing the weight of his family's crimes. He approached from behind, his footsteps familiar enough that she didn't turn around. 5 years, he said quietly. 5 years, she agreed. Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't believed that letter? If I'd trusted you instead of throwing you away in front of 400 people? Eveline considered the question. Sometimes. But I think we needed to break completely to rebuild into people capable of protecting what actually matters. You think we wouldn't have gotten here any other way? I think the versions of us from that ballroom were too fragile to survive what came after. We had to become harder, more willing to fight, less concerned with appearances and more focused on survival. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Do you miss them? The people we used to be? Not even a little. Eveline turned to face him. They were prettier, easier to love. But they weren't real. We are. Nathaniel felt something settle in his chest, the final piece of a puzzle he'd been assembling for years. The understanding that redemption wasn't about becoming the person you used to be before you failed. It was about accepting that failure changed you and choosing to build something meaningful from whoever you became in the aftermath. I love you, he said. Not the version from before. This one. The woman who survived everything I did to her and chose to keep fighting anyway. Eveline's smile was small and real. I love you too. The man who learned that power doesn't mean anything if you're not willing to sacrifice it for people who actually need protecting. They stood together in the fading light, two people who'd destroyed each other and been rebuilt by the work of trying to deserve a second chance. Neither of them had earned through grand gestures, but through years of showing up and doing the hard, unglamorous labor of making amends. It wasn't the ending either of them had imagined, but it was honest. And it was theirs. And in a world that demanded perfect narratives and tidy resolutions, maybe that messy, hard-won, imperfect collaboration was the only kind of love that actually survived contact with reality. 10 years after the scandal that destroyed them both, a journalist writing a retrospective on the Ashford family collapse tracked Nathaniel down in Invermar. She found him working on the construction of a new medical school wing, surrounded by students learning rural medicine and workers who'd spent careers in industries that had almost killed them. Can I ask you some questions? She said. Nathaniel set down his tools and wiped his hands. About what? About how you went from being one of Britain's most powerful dukes to working construction in a town most people can't find on a map. Nathaniel considered the question. I didn't go anywhere. I just stopped pretending power meant anything beyond the ability to help or hurt people, and I decided I'd spend enough time hurting them. People call you a reformer, a man who found his conscience. People are generous. Nathaniel's smile was tired. I'm just someone who failed catastrophically and had to rebuild from the wreckage. The work I do now doesn't erase what I failed to prevent. It just means the failure led somewhere other than more suffering. Do you have any regrets? Thousands. But the biggest one is how long it took me to understand that the people I was born to serve deserved better than my family ever gave them. Everything else flows from that. The journalist scribbled notes. And Eveline Carter? There are rumors you're together. We're partners. In the work. In the life we built. In the knowledge that some things break so completely, you can't go back to what they were. You just build something new from the pieces. That's not very romantic. Romance is overrated. Nathaniel picked up his tools. Partnership that survives reality is what matters. He went back to work before she could ask anything else, leaving her standing in sawdust and unfinished construction with the understanding that some stories didn't have tidy endings. They just had people who kept working long after the cameras stopped caring. That evening, Nathaniel found Eveline in her office finishing paperwork that could have waited until morning, but that she finished anyway because momentum was easier than stillness. "The journalist found me today," he said. "I know." She called asking for comment. "I didn't give her one." "Good." Nathaniel sat across from her. "What we did isn't for public consumption." "Agreed." Eveline set down her pen. "Let them write whatever narrative makes sense. We know the truth, which is that we're two deeply flawed people who hurt each other badly and had to become different versions of ourselves to survive. That power corrupts even when you're trying to use it for good. That fighting monsters sometimes requires becoming comfortable with your own capacity for cruelty. And that redemption isn't a moment. It's years of work that doesn't erase the past, but maybe earns the right to a future." Nathaniel felt his throat tighten. "That's not a story people want to hear." "No, but it's ours." Eveline stood and walked around the desk. "And I'd rather have an honest life with you than a perfect narrative with someone easier." She kissed him, not with the desperate passion of people trying to recapture something lost, but with the steady certainty of people who'd chosen each other repeatedly across years and battles and the grinding work of becoming worth choosing. When they pulled apart, Nathaniel rested his forehead against hers. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what? For not giving up on the work? Even when you'd given up on me." "I never gave up on you." Eveline's voice was soft. "I just stopped waiting for you to save yourself. Turns out you had to fall all the way down first. Best thing that ever happened to me." Eveline pulled back, studying his face. "You mean that? Every word. The man I was before you walked away in that ballroom was a coward hiding behind privilege. The man I am now at least knows what his cowardice cost and spends every day trying to make it mean something. That's all any of us can do. Survive the worst versions of ourselves and build something better from the wreckage." They stood together in the quiet office while the hospital around them continued its essential work, and the town outside settled into evening and 200 patients slept safely because people had fought battles most of them would never know about. It wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect. But it was real. And it was enough. And in the end, maybe that was the only kind of redemption that actually lasted. Not the grand gesture that erased the past, but the daily choice to keep building despite knowing how easily everything could collapse. Years later, when people asked what happened to Duke Nathaniel Ashford and the woman he betrayed, the answer depended on who was telling the story. Some said he'd found redemption through charity work and humble service. Others claimed he'd manipulated public sympathy to rebuild a reputation destroyed by his own corruption. A few suggested Eveline Carter had orchestrated the entire scandal to extract wealth and revenge from a family that had wronged hers. But in Invermar, where the hospital stood as permanent testament to what two broken people could build when they stopped trying to be perfect and just tried to be useful, the truth was simpler and harder than any narrative outsiders constructed. They were two people who'd destroyed each other and been rebuilt by the work of trying to deserve a second chance. Who'd learned that power was only meaningful when you were willing to sacrifice it? Who'd discovered that love wasn't about finding someone who completed you, but about choosing someone whose damage complemented yours well enough to build something functional from the wreckage? They were scarred, complicated, harder than they used to be and less certain that certainty mattered. But they were alive, and they were fighting. And in a world that demanded heroes or villains, maybe the most radical act was simply being human, flawed and failing and still showing up to do the work anyway. That was the story. Not the one anyone wanted to hear, but the one that was true. And truth, Nathaniel had finally learned, was the only foundation strong enough to build a life that survived contact with reality. The rest was just noise.